Margaret Whitmore slammed both palms flat against the frozen bakery counter and looked the man square in the eye. "That roof is going to kill somebody before spring, Walter." Walter Grayson laughed in her face, tore the apron from her waist, and hurled it into the snow. By nightfall, the whole of Silver Creek had watched a widow dragged from the only work she had left, and not one soul stepped forward to stop it. They believed the blizzard would finish what their cruelty had started. They were wrong. They were so very wrong. Before we go on, if you're watching, tell me in the comments the town you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story travels. And if a woman who refused to lie down ever mattered to you, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. Because what Silver Creek did to Margaret Whitmore, and what she did back, is a story you'll want to see finished. The apron lay in the snow like a wounded thing. Margaret did not go after it. She stood in the doorway of Grayson's bakery with her chin lifted and her hands still dusted white with flour, and she made herself watch the man she had worked beside for 3 winters as he wiped his palms down the front of his coat as though touching her apron had dirtied him. "You heard me," Walter Grayson said. "Go on. Get." "I heard a coward," Margaret said. The word landed in the shop like a dropped pan. A woman near the window, Hattie Abernathy, who bought 2 loaves every Tuesday and never once said thank you, gasped and pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. 2 men by the stove went very still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Walter's face went the color of a boiled beet. "You watch your mouth, woman." "Or what?" Margaret said. "You'll fire me. You've already done it. You'll throw me out. You're doing that too. There's not much left you can take, Walter, so I reckon I'll say my piece." "You'll say nothing." "I'll say the truth," she said, and she took 1 step toward him, and the boards creaked under her weight, and she saw him flinch. That flinch told her everything. He was afraid of her, not of her fists, of her being right. "Those beams over the flour room are split clean through," Margaret said. "I showed you the cracks in October. I showed you again after the first frost. I told you water was getting in and freezing and splitting them wider every night, and I told you what happens to green timber that freezes and thaws and freezes again. It gives, all at once. And when it gives, it's going to come down on whoever's standing under it, and this town has got its whole winter's flour stacked under it. The roof stood 10 years. It won't stand 10 more days, and you know it, Walter. That's the part I can't get past. You know it." Margaret held his eyes. "You went up in that flour room with a lantern 2 weeks ago. I saw you climb the ladder. I saw your face when you came down. You saw the cracks same as I did. And you didn't send for a carpenter, and you didn't move the flour, and you didn't do one single thing a sensible man does when he finds out his roof's fixing to fall. Now why is that? A man protects his stock. Why aren't you protecting yours?" Something flickered behind Walter's eyes. Just for a moment. The look of a man who has heard a door open that he thought was locked. "Watch yourself," he said low, "unless it isn't your stock." Margaret went on, and she kept her voice easy, conversational, the way you gentle a spooked animal. "Unless that flour's bought on somebody else's money, and it doesn't cost you a thing if it's ruined, and there's somebody who does very well indeed out of a town that can't buy bread come January. I do your books, Walter. I've seen whose name is on the paper. I've seen the—" "That's enough." He said it too fast and too loud, and 2 heads turned by the stove, and Margaret watched him hear his own panic and hate her for causing it. He lowered his voice again, but his hands had curled into fists. "You've been at my ledgers. My private ledgers. That's a woman going through a man's private business that's near enough to thieving. I could have you—" "You had me do those ledgers?" Margaret said mildly. "Every Friday when you were too far in the bottle to add a column. You'd wave your hand and say the widow will sort it. She's good with figures. And I sorted it. And I remember every line." She let that land. "So, you want to talk to me about my place and about being a baker and not a carpenter. But we both know that's not why you're throwing me out into a blizzard today. You're throwing me out because I can count, and because I've seen what I've seen, and you and the man who holds your paper would sleep a good deal easier if I were somewhere I couldn't say it out loud." For one long breath, the whole bakery hung silent. Then Walter Grayson did the only thing a cornered man knows how to do. He got loud and he got cruel, and he reached for the oldest weapon a small man has against a woman who frightens him. "You're a baker," Walter said, and he made the word sound like an insult. "You're not a carpenter and you're not a man, and you sure as sin are not the person who tells me how to run what my father built." "Your father would have listened. My father is dead." "So is my husband," Margaret said. "That doesn't make either of us free to be a fool." Somebody by the stove laughed a short, ugly bark quickly swallowed. Walter's chest swelled. He had an audience now, and men like Walter Grayson were only ever brave in front of an audience. "Thomas Whitmore," Walter said slowly, tasting it, "went down a mine shaft and got himself buried under a mountain because he didn't know when to quit. And you're just like him. You don't know your place, and you don't know when to shut your mouth, and that's why you're a widow, scrubbing my pans, instead of sitting pretty in a parlor somewhere." The shop went silent. Margaret felt the words go into her the way a splinter goes in small at the entry deep at the end. She did not let it show on her face. She had learned in the 2 years since they pulled Thomas out of that shaft that a face could be held like a wall if you built it right. "My husband," she said quietly, "died holding up a beam so 3 younger men could crawl out under his arms. 3 men who are alive right now because Thomas Whitmore knew exactly his place, Walter, and it was between danger and the people he loved. You wouldn't know a thing about that." Hattie Abernathy made a small sound. One of the men by the stove looked down at his boots, and one of them stood up. He was young, 19, maybe 20, with a rancher's hands and a hat he was turning round and round by the brim. Sam Cooper. His family ran cattle on the flats south of town, and his family, like every family in Silver Creek, owed the bank. "Mr. Grayson," Sam said, and his voice cracked and he pushed on through it. "Sir, I don't reckon it's right. She's telling you your roof's bad. My pa built barns 20 years, and he says the same thing about green timber and a hard freeze. She might be right. Seems to me you'd want to at least go up and look before you—" "Sit down, Sam. Before you throw a widow out in a storm over it. I said sit down." Walter did not raise his voice. That was the frightening thing. He lowered it. "How's your daddy's note doing at the bank, son? He's a payment behind, isn't he?" "2, I heard. Mr. Prentice was asking after it just yesterday, asking me what kind of family the Coopers were, whether they were the sort that honored their obligations. He let it sit there in the warm shop like a coal. I told him I'd have to think on it. On what kind of family you were." The color went out of Sam Cooper's young face. He looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him, and she gave the smallest shake of her head. "Don't, boy. It's not worth your father's land." And she watched the fight go out of him, the way it goes out of everyone in Silver Creek, sooner or later, when Amos Prentice's name is spoken over their heads. Sam sat down. "That's a good boy," Walter said. He turned back to Margaret, and the audience bravery came back into his face. "Now, get out of my shop." "Gladly. And you can leave the apron." "You keep the apron," Margaret said. "You'll need something to cry into." She turned and walked out into the cold. And behind her, she heard Walter shouting something about her wages, about how she'd earned nothing this week, about how she was lucky he didn't have the sheriff run her out for insolence. She let the door swing shut on the sound of him. The bell over the frame jangled once thin and cheerful, as though nothing at all had happened. Outside, the wind had teeth. Margaret bent and picked her apron out of the snow, shook it once and folded it over her arm. It was a good apron. She had sewn the pocket herself. There was no sense leaving a good apron to a man who wouldn't know what to do with it. That was when she saw them. The street was not empty. It was market morning, or what passed for one in December, and folks were out bundled, hunched, moving quick between the shops. And every one of them had seen. She could tell by the way they looked at her and then looked away, by the way Della Prentice, the banker's wife, gathered her skirts and crossed to the far boardwalk as though widowhood were catching, by the way old Sheriff Dobbs stood in the door of his office with his thumbs in his belt and did not move. Margaret walked down the middle of the street because the boardwalks had somehow filled with people who could not meet her eye. "Morning, Sheriff," she said. Dobbs shifted his weight. "Ms. Whitmore. You hear all that just now?" "Heard some." You have anything to say about a man throwing a widow out into a storm the week before Christmas, with her wages unpaid? The sheriff worked his jaw. He was not a bad man. That was the terrible thing about Silver Creek. Most of them were not bad men. They were only weak, and weakness in a town is worse than wickedness, because at least a wicked man can be named. Walter owns that shop, Dobbs said finally. Man's got a right to hire and fire on his own property. Ain't a thing in the law about it. No, Margaret agreed. I don't reckon there is. Now if you was owed money, you could file a— I'm owed 11 days, she said. I'm not going to see a penny of it, and you know it and I know it. But I thank you for the lesson in law, Sheriff. It's good to know exactly where a woman stands. She tipped her head at him the way a man might tip his hat. Right at the bottom of it. She walked on. She heard behind her Dobbs mutter something to the men gathering in his doorway. She didn't turn to catch it. She'd heard every word Silver Creek had for a woman like her, too big, too plain, too poor, too proud. She had heard them at the mercantile, and at the well, and in the pews of the church where they sang about mercy on Sunday, and practiced none of it on Monday. She was 32 years old, and she had buried a husband and worked her hands to leather, and the town had decided long ago that a woman shaped like her alone, like her, was a thing you could step around. There was one person left in Silver Creek she had not yet tried. She told herself she was a fool for trying. She tried anyway. Reverend Pauling was on the steps of the church, sweeping snow that would not stop falling, which was a fool's chore, but a preacher on a cold morning will find any excuse to look busy, so folks don't come at him with their troubles. Reverend, Margaret said. He looked up, and she watched him wish he had not. Mrs. Whitmore. A cold morning. It's going to be a colder one. Reverend, you've heard about the roof over Grayson's flower room. I've heard a great deal this morning. He kept sweeping. A great deal of talk. It's not talk. Those beams are going to fail, and when they do, this whole town loses its winter bread. You've got a pulpit. Folks listen to you Sunday when they won't listen to me any day of the week. If you stood up tomorrow and told them to move that flour to safe storage before the storm settles in, they'd do it. It'd take half a day and it'd save the town. The Reverend stopped sweeping. And if I stood up, he said slowly, and told this congregation that Walter Grayson, who tithes generously, and Amos Prentice, who bought us our new bell, were fools who couldn't keep a roof over their own flour. You think that ends well for me, Mrs. Whitmore? For the church. He shook his head. Mr. Prentice holds the note on this building. Did you know that the bell, the pews, the parsonage where my wife and my 4 children sleep, all of it on paper belongs to the bank until it's paid, and it will not be paid in my lifetime. He leaned the broom against the rail. You're asking me to set my family in the snow beside you, and for what a warning that might be wrong. You know it isn't wrong. I know, he said quietly, that I have 4 children. And there it was again. The same wall in a different set of clothes. Prentice did not need to threaten anyone himself. He had made the whole town into a machine that threatened itself. Each man silenced by his neighbor's fear. Each debt a link in one great chain, and the Reverend was only saying out loud what the sheriff had said, and Hattie would say, and every soul in Silver Creek had already decided in the privacy of their own frightened hearts. I'll pray for you, Reverend Pauling said. You do that, Margaret said. You pray real loud, Reverend. Loud enough maybe God'll hear it over the sound of that roof coming down. She turned to go, then stopped and looked back at him, and something in her face made the man take up his broom again just to have something to hold. You've got 4 children. I'll tell you a thing about children since you forgot it. They watch. Yours are watching you sweep snow off these steps while a woman stands here telling you the truth, and you send her off with a prayer. They'll remember it. Maybe not this year, but they'll grow and they'll look back and they'll know exactly what their daddy was when it counted. She pulled her collar up. Good morning, Reverend. She left him standing in the falling snow with his broom. She would have gone straight home to her little room behind the livery, but a voice stopped her. Ms. Whitmore. Ms. Whitmore, wait. It was Ellie Dobbs, the sheriff's own granddaughter, 9 years old, running down the boardwalk with her braids flying and no coat on, which meant she'd bolted out of somewhere she was supposed to stay put. "Ellie, where's your coat, child? You'll freeze. They're saying you're leaving." The girl skidded to a stop, breathless, her cheeks scoured red. "They're saying Mr. Grayson threw you out. Is it true you can't leave? You make the cinnamon twists?" Nobody else makes them right, they always burn the bottoms. And here was the thing that nearly broke Margaret when Walter Grayson's cruelty had not. This child, this one small person in a whole town of grown cowards running out into the cold with no coat because she could not bear the thought of Margaret gone. Margaret knelt down. Her knees protested. She didn't care. "Ellie," she said, "listen to me. You're going to be all right." "But you're going to be all right, and this town's going to be all right, and me, I'm going to be all right too, though I'll grant you it doesn't look like it this morning." She reached out and tucked a flying braid behind the girl's ear. "Now you go on home before your granddaddy sees you out here without a coat, or he'll have a fit, and Lord knows he's had enough excitement for one morning. Will you come back?" Margaret looked at the child's face. She did not lie to children. It was one of the few laws she kept. "I don't know," she said, "but I'll tell you what I do know. When somebody makes you feel small, Ellie, you look at your own two hands and you remember all the things they can do that his can't. Can you remember that for me?" Ellie nodded, solemn and streaming tears. "Good girl, go on now." The child ran. Margaret watched her go. Then she stood slow and pressed one hand to the small of her back and walked the rest of the way home alone. Her room behind the livery was 8 feet by 10, and it smelled of horse and of the yeast she kept in a crock by the one small window where the cold couldn't reach it. It had a narrow bed, a stool, a shelf of tin, and one trunk. In the trunk were the things that were hers alone in all the world. She opened it. On top lay Thomas's coat. She still could not part with it, though it was too small for her by half, and she'd never once worn it. Under the coat, wrapped in oilcloth, was his notebook. Thomas had been a mining man, but he'd been a reading man too, a rare thing on the frontier, and he'd filled that book front to back with figures, with drawings of pulleys and shoring timbers, with notes on how to read the way weight moved through wood and stone, how to find the place where a thing would fail before it failed. He used to read it aloud to her by the fire. "A beam don't lie to you, Maggie," he'd say. "A man will lie, a ledger will lie, but wood tells the truth right up to the second it breaks if you know how to listen." She had known how to listen. She had listened to that roof for 2 months, and nobody would hear her because the voice doing the telling belonged to a fat widow in a flour-dusted apron. She turned the pages until she found the one she wanted. It was a drawing of a valley, a bowl in the mountains, a spring marked with a little curl of steam, an arrow pointing north, and in Thomas's cramped hand, 3 words: "warm all winter." She remembered the night he'd drawn it. He'd come home from a prospecting trip, half froze and grinning like a boy, and he'd sat her down at their own table and drawn it out. "Found us a place, Maggie," he'd said. "You won't believe it till you see it. There's a spring up there, comes out of the rock warm as bathwater, and never freezes. Not in January, not in anything. Ground stays soft around it. A body could grow greens in the dead of winter. And it's tucked in behind a shoulder of the mountain, so the north wind goes clean over the top and never touches it. And who," she'd said laughing at him, "is going to haul us and a mule and a plow up a mountain? Nobody. That's the beauty of it. Nobody goes up there. Nobody can, which means nobody can bother us." He'd taken her hand across the table. "The day this world gets too mean for us, Maggie, and it will mark me, it's a mean world, and it's only getting meaner, that's where we go. We go up, and we let it be mean down here without us." "You're a dreamer, Thomas Whitmore." "I am," he'd agreed, "but I'm a dreamer who writes it down." And he'd tap the page. "It's all here, should you ever need it." Should you ever need it? He'd been dead 11 months now, dead before he ever knew he'd left her a map out of a trap that hadn't been set yet. Margaret ran her thumb over the little curl of steam. "You always did think ahead of me," she murmured. All right, you old dreamer. Let's see if your spring is real." Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed with the notebook in her lap, and for the first time all morning, she let her shoulders come down. "Well, Thomas," she said to the empty room, "they fired me." The room said nothing. Grayson, you'd have hated what he's become. His daddy was a decent man, and Walter's turned the shop into I don't even know what. He's in some kind of trouble with the bank, I think. He owes Prentice money. I'd stake my life on it, the way those two go into the back room and come out looking like cats over cream. She turned a page without seeing it. That's why he wanted me gone, if I'm honest. Not the roof. The roof's just what he could say out loud. The truth is, I do the books when he's drunk, and I've seen numbers in that ledger that don't add up to honest, and a man who's cheating doesn't like a witness who can count. She was talking to a dead man. She knew it. She did it anyway because a voice in the room was better than the silence, and because Thomas had been the one person on this earth who never once looked at her and saw something less than a whole human being. There was a knock at the door. Margaret wiped her face quickly with the heel of her hand, though there was nothing on it to wipe, and set the notebook aside. "It's open." The door swung in and let the cold and Hattie Abernathy in with it. Hattie stood on the threshold, clutching a cloth bundle to her chest, looking everywhere but at Margaret. She was a thin woman with a thin mouth, and she had never in 3 years said a kind word to Margaret Whitmore. She had in fact been among the first to call her the big Whitmore woman, as though she were livestock. "I heard," Hattie said. "I imagine the whole territory heard. Walter's got a carrying voice. I brought you—" Hattie thrust the bundle forward. "It's bread, and some salt pork, and a wedge of cheese, and it's not much." Margaret looked at the bundle. She looked at the woman. "You brought me bread," she said. Hattie flushed. "I know it's foolish, you being a baker, but I didn't know what else—" "It's not foolish." Margaret's voice had gone rough. She took the bundle and held it, and she felt the treachery of her own eyes stinging, and she blinked it back. "Thank you, Hattie. That's a decent thing you've done." "It's not," Hattie said, and now she did look up, and there was something wet and ashamed in her face. "It's not decent, Margaret. It's the opposite. It's what a person does instead of being decent. Decent would have been standing up in that shop this morning and saying you were right about the roof, because you are right. Everybody knows you're right, and not one of us said a word." Her mouth worked. "I stood there. I stood right there by the window, and I watched him throw your apron in the snow, and I did nothing. And now I've brought you a bundle. As if a wedge of cheese buys back a person's spine." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. "Why didn't you then?" Margaret asked. Not cruel, just wanting to know. "Why didn't any of you?" Hattie's hands twisted together. "Because Walter Grayson owns the bakery, and Amos Prentice owns the bank. And between the two of them, they own every note and every mortgage and every debt in Silver Creek. My husband owes on the store. The Coopers owe on their land. The whole town's into Prentice up to its neck, and the man who stands up for the widow today is the man who gets his loan called tomorrow." She shook her head. "It's not an excuse. There isn't an excuse, but that's the size of it. We're all of us afraid." And there it was. The thing Margaret had smelled but never seen plain. The town was not merely cruel, it was owned. Grayson and Prentice had their hands around Silver Creek's throat, and everyone knew it, and everyone had decided that keeping quiet was the price of keeping their homes. "Prentice," Margaret said slowly. "Amos Prentice. He's the one holds the paper on Walter's shop too, isn't he?" "I couldn't say." "You could. You just did." Margaret set the bundle on the bed. "Hattie, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer because it matters more than you know. When the flour's stacked in that back room and the roof comes down on it, and it will, I promise you, it will, who loses? Who eats the loss?" Hattie frowned. "Why the town? It's the winter's flour. If it's ruined, we've got no bread till the passes open in the spring." "No," Margaret said. "Think. Who paid for that flour Walter buys on credit, doesn't he? From the bank. That flour's bought with Prentice's money. So when it's ruined, Walter's out, nothing, he'll cry to Prentice, and Prentice will cover it because they're thick as thieves. But the town's got to eat. So come January, with no flour and a blizzard on, and folks getting desperate, who's going to be the one man in 50 miles with grain to sell? And at what price? And on what terms? She watched the understanding come into Hattie's face, like water into a cellar. "Oh," Hattie whispered. "They're not careless," Margaret said. "That's what I couldn't work out. A careless man ignores a warning about his roof. But Walter's not careless. He's greedy, and a greedy man ignores a warning about his roof when the roof coming down makes him richer. He wants that flower ruined. He wants this town hungry. Because a hungry town will sign anything, pay anything, hand over its land for a sack of meal, and Amos Prentice will be standing there with the papers already drawn." "Margaret." Hattie had gone white. "Margaret, if that's true." "It's true." "Then you have to tell the sheriff, you have to tell somebody." "I'm a fired baker being run out of town," Margaret said gently. "Who's going to believe me? I've no proof but a ledger I can't get to, and a dead man's notebook full of drawings about beams. No, nobody's going to believe me, Hattie. Not until that roof comes down exactly the way I said it would. And by then, it'll be too late to stop, and just in time to see who was telling the truth." Hattie stared at her. "Then you have to stay," Hattie said. "You have to stay and warn people. You can't just—" "He's fired me and thrown me out. And if I stand in the street, shouting that the banker means to starve the town, they'll call me a madwoman and lock me up, and Prentice will thank them for it." Margaret shook her head. "No. Sometimes the only way to make people hear a thing is to let it happen, and then be the one standing there when they finally understand. I can't stop what's coming, Hattie, but I can outlast it." "Outlast it how? Where will you even go?" Margaret looked toward the small window, toward the white world beyond it, where the wind was already picking up, already carrying the first fat flakes of the storm everyone could feel coming. "There's a valley," she said, "northwest up past the tree line in the folds under Cutthroat Peak. Thomas found it years back prospecting. He said there was a warm spring up there that never froze, and good south-facing ground and shelter from the north wind in a way he'd never seen anywhere in these mountains. He drew a map. It's in the book. He always said if the world ever got too mean, we'd go up there and let it be mean without us." Her mouth twisted not quite a smile. "Well, the world's got about as mean as I care to stand. You'll die up there," Hattie said flatly. "A woman alone in winter. Margaret, that's not brave, that's a death sentence, that's—" "Maybe." Margaret began methodically to pack. She rolled Thomas's coat and set it in the trunk. She took the crock of sourdough starter from the windowsill and wrapped it in 3 layers of wool, because whatever else she lost, she would not lose the starter. Her mother had carried it west, and her mother before that, and it was the one living thing that had come down to her unbroken, through 3 generations of hard women, and it would go with her, or nothing would. "Maybe I'll die. But I'll tell you what I won't do, Hattie. I won't stand in that street one more day and let them watch me. I won't beg the sheriff. I won't take Walter's charity if he offered it, which he won't. And I will not." Her voice cracked, and she mastered it. "I will not let the last thing this town remembers about Margaret Whitmore be the day she got thrown in the snow and cried about it." She latched the trunk. "If I'm going to be talked about," she said, "I'll pick what they say." Hattie was crying now openly the way a person cries when shame and grief and helplessness all come at once. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I should have—" "You brought me cheese," Margaret said, and she found to her own surprise that she could smile. "It's a start, Hattie. It's a start. Now dry your face and do one thing for me, one real thing, and we'll call your spine bought back fair and square. Anything. When it comes down the roof, the flour, all of it, and folks are frightened and hungry and looking for somebody to hate, you tell them the truth. You tell them the widow warned Walter Grayson to his face in front of witnesses, and he laughed at her. You make them remember they knew. Don't let them pretend it was an accident nobody saw coming. Can you do that?" Hattie nodded hard. "I can do that." "Then we're square." Margaret shouldered the smaller of her 2 bundles. "Now help me get this trunk out to Ruth." Ruth was the mule. Ruth was old, and Ruth was ornery, and Ruth was, aside from the starter, the last thing on earth that belonged to Margaret Whitmore. Thomas had bought her the year they married, when Ruth was already no spring foal, and the 2 of them, the widow and the mule, had grown gray together in the years since. Ruth stood in the lean-to behind the livery, and when Margaret came out into the falling snow, the mule turned her long head and gave a low, complaining bray, as if to say, "In this weather." "I know," Margaret told her. "I know, girl. I don't like it either, but we can't stay." She loaded Ruth with the care that came from having nothing to spare. The trunk, the sacks of what supplies she had: beans, a little cornmeal, a side of bacon. She'd been saving a twist of salt, a bag of seed she'd been hoarding since October, without quite knowing why, and now she knew why. Her tools: an axe, a hatchet, a shovel, a coil of rope, a hank of wire, the good knife. Thomas's rifle and what shells she had. The starter closest to her body inside her own coat, where her warmth could keep it from freezing. And the notebook. Always the notebook. Hattie stood in the falling snow and watched. "The liveryman'll want board for that lean-to," she said. "Grayson probably told him not to." "Board's paid through the month," Margaret said. "I paid it Tuesday before I knew. Small mercies." By the time she was loaded, the storm had thickened. The far end of the street had gone soft and white and indistinct, and the mercantile at the corner was just a shape. A few figures moved through the murk, going home battening down, doing the small, frightened business of people who could feel a big storm coming and wanted walls between it and them. None of them came near. Word had traveled. The Whitmore woman was leaving, and there is nothing a coward avoids so carefully as the person he has wronged. But she was wrong about one thing. One of them came. He came out of the swirling white on foot, hunched into a coat too thin for the cold, and it took Margaret a moment through the snow to recognize the shape of him, and when she did, her stomach turned over. It was Amos Prentice, the banker. He was a soft, pink, careful man, Prentice, with pale eyes and clean hands, and a way of smiling that never reached above his mouth. He picked his way across the frozen ruts of the street toward the lean-to, holding his hat against the wind, and he stopped a careful few feet from Margaret and the loaded mule, and he smiled the smile. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "a terrible business. Terrible. I heard about your difficulty with Walter, and I said to myself, Amos, you must go and see if there's some Christian thing to be done." "Did you?" Margaret said. "I did." He clasped his clean hands together. "You've had a hard turn. A widow alone in weather like this. It weighs on a man, and I thought, well, I have a small property, a room, nothing grand but warm over the bank. And I thought a woman handy in a kitchen might earn her keep there through the winter, cook a little, keep house, nothing improper." He added quickly, seeing something in her face. "I'm only offering a roof over a poor woman's head. Charity, nothing more." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The snow settled on his shoulders. She had spent 2 months smelling this and never quite seeing it, and now here it was, wearing a wet hat and offering her a warm room. "That's a kind offer, Mr. Prentice," she said. "I'll ask you a question, and then I'll give you my answer. Fair, of course. How much does Walter Grayson owe your bank?" The smile stayed on his mouth. It went out of his eyes. "I'm sure I couldn't discuss another man's private, because I did his books," Margaret said, "when he was too drunk to hold a pen, which was most Fridays. And I've seen the note. And I've seen the flour bought on your credit stacked under a roof that's coming down. And I've seen the sort of terms a man draws up when he wants land more than he wants his money back." She took a step toward him, and the snow crunched, and Amos Prentice, soft pink. Careful Amos Prentice took a step back without meaning to. "So I know what your warm room is, sir. It's a place to keep the one woman in this town who can read a ledger kept quiet, and kept close where you can watch her till whatever you've got planned is done, and it's too late for her telling to matter. That's your Christian thing." Prentice's mouth had gone very small. "You are an ungrateful," he said quietly, "and unwell woman. I offer you charity, and you spin fancies, slanders." The soft was gone from him now. Something cold and flat had come up underneath it. "You'd do well to take the room, Mrs. Whitmore. The mountain is no place for a person given to imaginings. People who go up into that country in winter do not always come back. And when they don't, no one is surprised, and no one asks questions, and no one is left to spin fancies about their betters." It was a threat. It was the plainest thing he'd said, and it was a threat, and both of them knew it. Margaret smiled at him. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who has just been handed at last the proof she couldn't find. "Thank you, Mr. Prentice," she said. He blinked. "For what?" "For coming out in the snow to tell me I'm right. A guilty man doesn't threaten a mad woman. He laughs at her. You didn't laugh." She took Ruth's lead rope in her flower-scarred hand. "You're frightened of me. You and Walter both. You're frightened of what I know and what I can count, and you should be, and I want you to carry that back down the street with you and warm yourself on it tonight. Because I'm going up that mountain, and the mountain is not going to take me whatever you're hoping. And when I come down again, and I will come down again, I'm going to be holding everything I need to hang the both of you by your own paper." For one moment, real fear crossed the banker's soft face. Then he mastered it, and the mouth smile came back. "You'll be dead by February," he said pleasantly. "Good day, Mrs. Whitmore. God keep you." And he turned and picked his way back across the street, holding his hat, and the white swallowed him. Margaret stood a moment breathing. Then Hattie was at her elbow, gray-faced. "Margaret! Margaret, did you hear him? He as good as said he'd—" "I heard him. You can't go now. You heard what if he wants you dead, then going up there alone is exactly what he—" "If I stay, he owns me by spring," Margaret said. "If I go, I've got a chance. It's a poor chance and a cold one, but it's mine, and it's more than he means for me to have, and that's reason enough to take it." She swung the last strap over Ruth's load and cinched it. "Besides, he just did me a great favor, and he doesn't even know it." "What favor?" "He told me I was right." Margaret's jaw set. "I've been 2 months not sure whether I was seeing a crime or seeing shadows." A woman starts to doubt herself when the whole world tells her she's a fool. But Amos Prentice just walked out into a blizzard to threaten my life over a ledger, and a man doesn't do that over shadows. So now I know. Now I'm certain. And a certain woman, Hattie, is a dangerous thing no matter what she weighs or what she wears or how many men have laughed at her. She patted the mule's neck. "Come on, Ruth. Let's go before I lose my nerve or my daylight." Hattie caught her sleeve. "At least let me get you—" "You've got a husband who owes the bank," Margaret said, not unkindly. "And a banker who just showed me exactly how he handles people who cross him. You stood in that lean-to and talked to me today, and that was brave. Braver than anything anybody's done for me all winter, and I won't have you pay for it. Go home, bar your door, and when the roof comes down—" She fixed the woman with a look. "You remember what you promised me. You tell them the truth." Hattie's eyes filled again. "I'll tell them," she whispered. "I swear it, Margaret. I'll tell every soul in Silver Creek." "Then you've done more than the sheriff and the preacher and every man in this town put together." Margaret pulled her collar up. "Go on now. Go home." Hattie went. She stopped once at the mouth of the alley and looked back a thin, dark shape against the white and lifted one hand. Margaret lifted hers. Then the woman was gone into the storm, and Margaret Whitmore was alone with an old mule and a warm crock of yeast against her heart and a dead man's map inside her coat. She led Ruth out of the lean-to and to the edge of town. Silver Creek did not watch her go. That was the last cruelty of it, and somehow the worst. When they'd thought there was a show in it, a widow shamed an apron in the snow, they'd lined the boardwalks to see. But leaving was quiet, and leaving was cold, and there was no sport in it, and so they had all gone inside to their fires and their suppers, and left the street to her. She walked its length alone, past the darkened bakery, past the bank where a lamp burned in an upstairs window, and a pale shape stood watching from behind the glass, past the church where somebody had already begun cheerfully to ring the bell for evening service, calling the good people of Silver Creek in out of the cold to pray. Margaret did not stop at the church. At the very edge of town where the last fence gave out and the road turned to a rumor under the snow, a small figure was waiting, coatless, braids frozen stiff, shivering so hard her teeth clacked. "Ellie Dobbs," Margaret said, "you are going to catch your death. I brought you something." The girl held out both mittened hands. In them was a tin star, a child's toy cut from a can lid. Its points filed smooth a loop of string through the top. "It's my lucky star. My daddy made it before he died. I want you to have it so you don't get lost. Stars are how you don't get lost. My daddy told me." Margaret knelt in the snow for the second time that day. She took the tin star. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. "Ellie," she said, and had to stop and start again. "This is the finest thing anyone has given me in a very long time. And I am going to keep it right here." She looped the string over her own head and tucked the star inside her collar against the warm crock against her heart. "And every time I look at it, I'm going to think about a girl brave enough to run out into a blizzard with no coat for a woman everybody else forgot. You hear me? You did that. Nobody made you. That was you. You'll come back," the girl whispered. And Margaret, who did not lie to children, found that something in her had changed since morning. Since the apron in the snow, and Hattie's cheese, and the banker's threat, and this. Since she had stopped being a woman running away and started being a woman with a reckoning to keep. "Ellie Dobbs," she said, "you go home and get warm, and you keep watch on the northwest sky up past Cutthroat Peak. And one of these days when the pass is open and the mean part of the winter's done, you're going to see smoke up there. And you'll know it's me, and you'll know I'm coming back." She stood. "That's a promise. I don't make them lightly, and I don't break them at all. Now run, child. Run home." Ellie ran. Margaret watched until the storm took her, until she was sure the girl was small and safe and moving fast toward warmth. Then she turned her face to the northwest, toward the white wall of the mountains, toward the place a dead man had drawn on a page against exactly such a day as this. The wind hit her full in the face and tried to turn her back. She leaned into it. "All right, Thomas," she said, and her voice did not shake, though the cold had got into her bones already, and the light was failing, and the road ahead was nothing but white, on white, on white. "All right, let's go find your valley." And Margaret Whitmore, 32 years old, widowed, fired, threatened, and utterly wholly alone, took the first step up into the mountains that Silver Creek was certain would kill her, one hand on the lead rope of an old gray mule, one hand pressed to the living warmth beneath her coat, and a child's tin star hidden over her heart where no one could take it. Behind her the church bell rang and rang. Ahead of her the snow came down like the closing of a door. She did not look back. The mountain did not care that she did not look back. It took the road within an hour. One moment there were wheel ruts under the snow to follow some memory of men having passed this way, and the next there was nothing, only white and more white, and the wind coming down off the peaks like it had a grudge. "Steady, Ruth," Margaret said. "Steady, girl. 1 foot. Then the next one. That's all it ever is." Ruth did not believe her. Ruth stopped at the first deep drift and set all 4 legs and would not move, and Margaret hauled on the lead rope until her shoulders screamed, and the mule only laid her ears back and brayed her misery into the storm. "I know," Margaret gasped. "I know it's foolish. I know we should be by a fire. But there is no fire for us down there, do you understand me? There's a warm room and a locked door and a man watching me count his crimes. That's what's down there, so we go up." She got behind the mule and she pushed. She was a large woman, and she was strong in a way the men of Silver Creek had never bothered to notice all those years of hauling flour sacks and 100-weight barrels, and she put every pound of herself into the mule's haunch, and she shoved. Ruth lurched, broke through, stumbled forward onto firmer ground. And Margaret went down face first into the drift the mule had just left, and lay there a second tasting snow, and laughed a short, cracked, terrible laugh. "There," she said to the mountain. "That's one." By full dark, she had climbed higher than any road went, and the cold had changed. It was no longer a cold that hurt. That was the thing that frightened her. Her feet had stopped complaining. Her hands wrapped in wool had gone from aching to a dull, far-off nothing, and Thomas's voice came to her out of the notebook, out of 100 fireside nights cold. "That stops hurting is cold, that's winning, Maggie. You feel that you make fire, or you die. There's no third thing." She made fire. She made it with hands that would barely close, kneeling in the lee of a boulder where the wind couldn't quite reach, feeding it. Shavings off a dry pine root. She dug from under the snow with the hatchet, and the first spark died, and the second died, and the third caught a curl of shaving, and then died too. And Margaret heard herself make a sound she did not like. A thin animal sound, and she stopped. "No," she said out loud. "No, you do not get to make that sound. Not yet." She cupped her whole body around the little nest of tinder. She breathed on it slow, the way you'd breathe on a frightened child. And the fourth spark caught and held and grew, and a flame no bigger than a fingernail stood up in the dark. And Margaret Whitmore, who had faced down Walter Grayson and Amos Prentice, without a tremor, put her frozen face down near that flame and wept with relief. That was the first night. She did not sleep. She fed the fire, and she kept Ruth close, and she pulled the crock of starter out of her coat and held it up to the light and pressed her thumb against the wool. Still warm, still alive. The one living thing besides the mule she had left in the world, and it had come through the first night with her. "You and me both, then," she told it. The second day the storm broke, which should have been mercy, and was instead a new cruelty, because the sun came out on a world so white and so bright that it burned her eyes, and by afternoon she could barely see, and she walked with them, squinted to slits following the mountain by the shape of it against the sky, and by the dead man's map she pulled out and studied at every rise, and the map was wrong. That was the thing that nearly finished her worse than the cold, worse than the snow blindness. She came over a shoulder of the mountain, where the map said there'd be a saddle between two peaks, and there was no saddle. There was a cliff, a sheer white drop into nothing, and the wind coming up it, and no way down, and no way around, that she could see, and Margaret stood at the edge of it with a dead man's drawing shaking in her hand, and something in her chest simply gave. "You were wrong," she whispered. And then louder to the empty peaks to the sky to the husband who was not there. "You were wrong, Thomas. There's no saddle, there's no valley. There's a cliff and a woman about to freeze to death because she believed a drawing in a book." The mountains gave her back her own voice, and nothing else. She sank down in the snow. Ruth nosed at her hair. And Margaret, for the first time since the apron hit the snow in Silver Creek, let herself think the thought she had been out running for 2 days, they were right. Prentice was right. The mountain's going to take me, and no one will be surprised, and no one will ask questions, and Ellie will watch the northwest sky for smoke that never comes. She thought about the little girl, and that was what saved her in the end. Not courage, not faith. A 9-year-old with frozen braids and a tin star standing at the edge of town asking, "Will you come back?" and a woman who did not lie to children answering, "That's a promise." "I don't break them at all," Margaret said thickly. "I said I don't break them at all." She got up. She wiped her face. And she made herself do the thing Thomas would have done, the thing the notebook was full of. She stopped trusting her fear and started trusting her eyes. She looked, really looked at the cliff. And she saw that it was not a cliff the whole way. Off to the west, where a spur of rock ran down, there was a ledge, a narrow, wicked, snow-covered ledge, but a ledge angling down and around the shoulder toward whatever lay beyond. Thomas hadn't drawn a saddle. He'd drawn a way through, and she'd read it wrong in her panic, because a frightened woman reads everything wrong, and she was done being frightened. "West," she told Ruth. "We go west, along the rock. And if you put 1 foot wrong on that ledge, you ornery old fool, you'll take us both off the mountain, so please, for the love of God, don't." They went along the ledge. It took the rest of the light. There was one moment when Ruth's back hoof broke through a lip of frozen snow, and the mule screamed and scrambled, and half her weight went out over the drop, and Margaret grabbed the lead rope and threw her own whole body backward into the rock, and hauled with everything 3 generations of hard women had put into her arms, and for one heartbeat the world hung on whether a fat widow was stronger than gravity. She was. Ruth's hoof found stone. The mule heaved back onto the ledge trembling, blowing great clouds of steam, and Margaret lay against the rock with the rope burning through her wool and her heart trying to climb out of her mouth, and neither of them moved for a long, long time. "We're not doing that again," Margaret said when she could speak. "We are absolutely not ever doing that again." They came around the shoulder of the mountain as the last light went. And there it was. She smelled it before she saw it, a smell that had no business. In that frozen, dead white world, a warm mineral wet smell green underneath it, impossible. And then she came down off the last of the ledge into a fold in the mountain that the north wind went clean over the top of exactly as a dead dreamer had promised, and in the center of it, black and open and steaming into the freezing air, was water. Warm water, coming up out of the rock, never freezing, just as he'd said. Margaret Whitmore walked down to the edge of Thomas's spring, and she knelt, and she put her ruined hands into water, warm as bathwater, and she did not weep this time. She was past weeping. She just knelt there with her hands in the warmth, and her face turned up to the first stars, and after a while she said very quietly, "I'm sorry I doubted you. I found it. Thomas, I found it. I'm home. I found." She did not know yet that a man was already that very week riding up toward the base of these same mountains, a man missing 11 head of cattle and a good deal of his patience, and that the smoke she was about to start making would carry farther than she meant it to. She only knew that she was alive and warm for the first time in 2 days, and that the ground around the spring was soft. She got to work. A woman who has decided to live works differently than a woman who is merely trying not to die. Margaret had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she had learned to store the strength that came from it, and now, alone on a mountain, with no one to prove anything to, she let it all out. She built a shelter first low against the rock, where the warm ground kept the frost from her back, roofed with pine boughs and the oilcloth, and packed snow, which sounds like nothing, and is everything, because snow packed thick does not let the cold through. Thomas had a page on it, and she'd read the page, and she built the thing the page described. The first roof fell in on her the second night, and dumped 100 weight of snow on her head, and she said words she'd never said in church. The second roof held. She slept under it warm for the first time with Ruth's bulk against the entrance, and the spring steaming 10 feet away, and she woke up not dead, which she had begun to count as the highest form of luck. Then she built the oven. This was the thing that no one in Silver Creek would ever have believed a woman could do, and it was the thing she did best. She knew fire, and she knew heat, and she knew from a lifetime of it exactly how a thing had to be shaped to hold warmth and let smoke draw and bake a loaf through without burning the bottom, the very thing Ellie had wept about. She hauled flat stones from the spring's edge where the warm water had loosened them from the frost. She mortared them with clay she dug from the soft warm ground and mixed with her own hands. She built it low and round and thick-walled, a beehive of stone with a mouth that faced away from the wind, and it took her 4 days and 3 times a wall slumped, and she tore it down and started over, and the third time she sat in the snow and shook and thought she couldn't. She just couldn't, and then she thought about a banker saying, "You'll be dead by February," and she got up and built it again. On the 6th day, she baked bread. She fed the starter that had crossed the mountain against her heart. She mixed it with the last of her flour and water warm from the spring, and she let it rise in the warmth of the shelter, and she fired the oven with pine and let it come up to heat, the way her body knew heat without a thermometer, without anything but 40 years of women's hands, and she slid the loaf in on a flat stone. And when she pulled it out golden and cracked across the top, the way a good loaf cracks and steaming and smelling like the one thing in all the world that had never once let her down. Margaret Whitmore sat down in the snow outside her own oven that she had built with her own hands on a mountain that was supposed to kill her. And she held that hot loaf against her chest, and she laughed and she cried at the same time until she couldn't tell which was which. "You should see me, Thomas," she said. "You should just see me." She could not have known that the smoke from that oven that day rose straight and tall in the still cold air, and that a rider 3 miles off and 1,000 feet below reined in his horse and stared up at a plume of smoke rising from a fold in the mountain, where he absolutely knew no living soul had any business being. The weeks that came after were the strongest of Margaret's life, and the loneliest, and she would not have traded a single one. She dug up the warm ground by the spring and planted the seed she'd hoarded since October, and greens came up green in the dead of winter, impossible just as Thomas had sworn. She snared rabbits with Thomas's wire and shot a deer with Thomas's rifle, and smoked the meat over a slow fire she tended like a baby. She patched the shelter into something that could almost be called a home, She talked to Ruth and to the starter and to the husband who wasn't there. And she was in a way she had not been since the mine took Thomas entirely herself. No one to shrink, for no one to apologize, to no eye on her measuring her size against her worth. And every few days she baked bread, and the smoke rose. She was pulling a loaf from the oven on a gray, still morning, when Ruth threw up her head and brayed a warning, and Margaret went very still and listened and heard from below, the one sound that did not belong in her mountain. Hoofbeats, not Ruth's. Ruth was right there. Another horse shod coming up through the timber toward the fold in slow, careful switchbacks, the sound of a rider who knew mountains, who knew not to rush a slope, and that careful competence was somehow more frightening than a gallop would have been. Margaret set the loaf down on a stone. She thought very clearly in the space of one breath of Amos Prentice's soft voice in the snow. People who go up into that country in winter do not always come back, and when they don't, no one is surprised, and no one asks questions. She had been up here 2 months, long enough for a patient man to be sure the mountain hadn't done his work for him, long enough to send someone up to finish it. She went into the shelter and she took Thomas's rifle down, and she checked the load with hands that did not shake anymore because she was not that frightened woman on the cliff. Not now, not after everything she'd built. She came back out and she stood beside her oven with the rifle held easy across her body, not raised, just ready, and she watched the last switchback of the timber where the rider would come out. He came out slow. A big man on a big horse. Both of them rhymed with frost. The man hunched into a worn brown leather vest over a coat that had seen better decades. A rifle of his own scabbarded at his knee. A face under the hat brim that was all weather and silence. He came out of the timber, and he saw her, a large woman standing beside a stone oven, with fresh bread cooling on it, and a rifle in her hands, and Margaret watched him do a thing she did not expect. He stopped his horse, and he took his hands off the reins and held them out to the sides, plain where she could see them. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough with cold. "I'm not going to reach for anything. I want you to see that." "That's wise of you," Margaret said, "because I will shoot you off that horse, mister, and I won't lose sleep, and I've got the whole mountain to bury you in, and all winter to do it. So you keep those hands right where they are, and you tell me who sent you." Something moved across the man's weathered face. Confusion, she thought, or a good imitation of it. "Nobody sent me," he said. "I've been 3 days tracking 11 head of cattle that drifted off in the last storm. I saw smoke. I figured a line shack or a prospector froze in his cabin. I did not figure." His eyes moved once over the oven, the shelter, the winter garden green against the snow, the mule, the bread, and back to her face, and something in him seemed to give up on making sense of it. "I did not figure this. Ma'am, if you don't mind my saying, what in God's name are you doing up here?" "Surviving," Margaret said, "which I intend to keep doing. Get down off that horse. Slow. Keep your hands where I can see them, and your rifle where it is." He got down slow. He was bigger on the ground than he'd looked, mounted a head and shoulders over most men, and Margaret kept the rifle easy and kept her distance, because size was a thing she understood better than most, having been made to feel every ounce of her own, and she was not going to be fool enough to let a big man close, because he had a soft voice and open hands. "I'll ask you again," she said. "Who sent you? And before you lie to me, mister, you should know I'm real good at spotting a lie on account of I've been lied to by professionals, and you don't have their polish. I told you the truth." He said it flat, not offended, just stating it. "Nobody sent me. My name's Caleb Walker. I run cattle down on the Sweetgrass Flats other side of these mountains, from wherever it is you came up from. I lost 11 head in the storm before last. Good stock. I can't afford to lose 'em, so I've been up here tracking 'em 3 days, froze half to death, and I saw your smoke, and I came to it because that's what you do in this country. You see smoke in winter, you go to it because somebody's either in trouble or able to help, and either way you go." He paused. "I did not expect to have a rifle pointed at me by a lady baking bread on top of a mountain." "I'll grant you that's a first." Margaret studied him. He had the ring of truth to him, but she had learned the hard way that some men could ring true and be hollow as a bell, and one of them held the paper on her whole hometown. "Sweetgrass Flats," she said. "That's north. You said you came up the other side, so you're not from Silver Creek." Something flickered in his face at the name. She caught it. She'd been watching for it. "You know Silver Creek," she said. It was not a question. Caleb Walker was quiet a moment. When he spoke, he chose his words the way a man chooses his steps on bad ice. "I know of it," he said. "I've bought supplies there times, sold stock through there." He looked at her, and there was something careful in it now, something that had gone alert. "Ma'am, is that where you came up from Silver Creek?" "Why?" "Because," he stopped, started again. "Because there's a story going around down in the low country. Come up the trails these last weeks the way stories do. About Silver Creek and about a—" He stopped again, and Margaret saw him decide to say it plain. "About a widow woman that went crazy and walked off into the mountains in the big December blizzard and died up there. They've been telling it at every fire from here to the railhead. The Mad Whitmore widow, they call her, frozen up in the peaks. Some say she cursed the town on her way out. Some say her ghost." "Stop," Margaret said. He stopped. She stood very still, and the rifle in her hands had gone still with her, and inside her chest, something cold and clear was assembling itself piece by piece into a shape she recognized. She had wondered up here in the long nights what Prentice would do, whether he'd send a man. She had never once imagined this, that he wouldn't need to send a man at all because he'd send a story instead, and a story travels faster and kills cleaner and never has to worry about her rifle. "Mad," she repeated. "They're saying I went mad." "That's the story." Caleb was watching her closely now. "You're her. The Whitmore widow. Margaret Whitmore." She lifted her chin. "And I am not mad, Mr. Walker, and I am not dead, and I am not a ghost. And if you'll look around you, you'll see a woman who built every stick and stone of this by herself in the worst winter these mountains have thrown in 20 years, which is a peculiar thing for a corpse to manage." Her voice had gone hard and steady. "So you tell me. Who's telling that story down in the low country? Who put it in the air?" He thought about it. He was a slow, careful man, and she was coming to see that the slowness was not dullness. It was weight that he did not say a thing until he had turned it over and looked at the underside. "I couldn't name the first mouth it came out of," he said finally. "That's not how stories work. But I'll tell you a thing I noticed since you asked because it struck me odd at the time." He met her eyes. The men telling it hardest, the ones passing it on most careful, they were bank men, Prentice men, fellows who'd been down to Silver Creek and back on the banker's business. They were the ones made real sure everybody heard the widow died crazy in the mountains. Made sure of it. And I remember thinking at the time, that's a lot of care to take over one dead widow that nobody down there seemed to much like when she was alive. The rifle came down. Margaret didn't decide to lower it. Her arms just lowered it of their own accord, because a man who had noticed that a stranger, a cattleman with no stake in any of it who had seen the shape of the lie from the outside and thought, that's a lot of care to take, was not a man Amos Prentice had sent. Prentice's men didn't notice things and say them out loud to armed strangers on mountaintops. Prentice's men said what they were told. "No," she said half to herself. "It's a lot of care to take. You're right. It's exactly right." She looked at him with new eyes. "You've got a good head, Mr. Walker." "I've got a cold one," he said, "and two hands that stopped feeling about an hour ago, if it's all the same to you. Ma'am, I don't mean to press, but you've got an oven throwing heat, and I've got frostbite starting in my fingers, and I'd take it kindly if I could stand by that fire long enough to keep all 10 of them." Margaret looked at him a long moment. Then she did the thing that Silver Creek had never once done for her. She looked at a cold and honest stranger, and she stepped aside and she made room by her fire. "Come warm your hands, Mr. Walker," she said. "But you leave your rifle on your saddle and you mind your manners, and the first wrong move you make is your last one. We understand each other." "Yes, ma'am." He came forward slow and he pulled his gloves off with his teeth, and he held his big ruined hands out to the oven's heat, and he closed his eyes for a second, at the pure animal relief of it, and Margaret watched him and thought despite herself that she had not stood beside another human being in 2 months, and that she had not until this exact moment let herself feel how much that had cost her. "You built all this," Caleb said low, his eyes still closed. It wasn't a question. It was a kind of wonder. The oven, the shelter, the garden. You, alone. In this. "I did." He opened his eyes and looked at the loaf cooling on the stone, and then he looked at her, and there was nothing in his face of the way the men of Silver Creek had looked at her. Nothing measuring nothing, dismissing nothing, that made her want to make herself smaller. "I've wintered in this country 20 years, he said. "I've known mountain men and trappers and old hands that were half wild and tougher than boot leather. I never knew one of them could have done what you did up here, not one." He shook his head slow. "And they got a whole town down there telling each other you're a crazy woman that couldn't do a thing but freeze and die." "Yes," Margaret said. "They do." "Why?" Caleb asked. "Why'd they turn you out? A woman that can do this. Why in God's name would a town throw you away?" And Margaret Whitmore, who had told the whole truth to no living soul but a 9-year-old and a thin, frightened woman with a wedge of cheese, looked at this big, quiet, honest stranger, warming his ruined hands at the oven she'd built on the mountain, that was supposed to kill her, and something in her some door that had been barred a long time came open. "Sit down, Mr. Walker," she said. "It's a long story, and it's a cold day, and I've got bread, and you've got frostbite, and I reckon we've both got nowhere better to be." She broke the loaf in two with her hands, and held half of it out to him steaming in the freezing air. "Eat first, then I'll tell you what they did. And when I'm done, you can decide for yourself whether the Whitmore widow's crazy. But I'll warn you now." And here, the corner of her mouth turned up the first true, almost smile she'd worn in 2 months. "You're not going to like what you hear, and you're going to like even less what it means about the men you rode past on your way up into these hills." Caleb Walker took the bread. He held it a moment like it was something more than bread, and maybe it was because she watched him understand a man 3 days cold and hungry, handed the first warm thing a human being had offered him in that whole frozen country. She watched him understand exactly what it cost to make it, and exactly what it meant to be given it. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've eaten in the finest houses this territory's got, and I don't believe a one of 'em ever handed me a thing that meant what this does." He ate, and Margaret told him. She told him about the roof and the cracks she'd showed Walter Grayson twice, and the flour stacked under beams that were going to fail. She told him about the ledgers she did on Drunken Fridays, and the numbers that didn't add up to honest and Prentice's paper on every note and mortgage in Silver Creek. She told him about the apron in the snow, and the whole town watching, and not a soul stepping forward, and about the sheriff's lesson in law, and the preacher's 4 children, and Sam Cooper sitting back down when his family's note got mentioned. She told him about the banker coming out into the blizzard to offer her a warm room, and what the warm room really was, and the threat under the softness people who go up into that country do not always come back. And she told him the thing she'd worked out in the lean-to, the thing that was the whole black heart of it, that the roof coming down wasn't an accident they were ignoring. It was a robbery they were arranging. A town made hungry on purpose. A whole community's land and homes waiting to be bought for a sack of meal by the one man who'd have grain to sell when the snow came down and the flour was ruined. Caleb Walker listened to all of it without once interrupting his half-loaf forgotten in his hand, his weathered face going harder and stiller with every mile of it. When she finished, he was quiet a long time. "That flour," he said at last. "When you left, was it still stacked under those beams?" "Every sack. He wouldn't move it. I begged him to move it, and he threw my apron in the snow." "And you left in the middle of December?" "I did." Caleb Walker looked down the mountain in the direction he'd come, in the direction of the low country, and the trails and the town he'd bought supplies in more than once. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I don't know how to tell you this, gentle, so I'll just say it. That flour's already come down." Margaret went cold in a way the mountain had never made her. "What?" "The story that came up the trails," Caleb said. "The one about the mad widow. It didn't come alone. It came with news." He met her eyes, and there was something terrible in his face now, the look of a man who has just fit two pieces together and does not like the picture. Silver Creek's bakery roof came down in the first hard freeze after the blizzard. Killed the whole town's winter flower. Buried it. There's folks down there right now, families, children, got no bread and no way to get any till the passes open in the spring. The half loaf in Margaret's hand seemed suddenly to weigh 100 pounds. And I'll tell you the other half of the news since you'll want it, Caleb said, and his voice had gone flat and hard as a gun barrel. Since we're fitting the pieces together, you and me, there's a man been going farm to farm down in that valley these last weeks, buying up notes, buying up land off folks so hungry and so scared they're signing anything he puts in front of them for a wagon of grain to get their young ones through to spring. He paused. You want to guess the name on that man's papers, Mrs. Whitmore? You want to guess whose grain it is, come to save the day at 10 times the price. Margaret did not have to guess. She stood very still beside her oven with a stranger's confirmation ringing in her ears and half a loaf of bread going cold in her hand, and she understood that everything she had feared in that lean-to 2 months ago had already happened. The roof was down. The town was hungry. The land was being bought. She had been up here baking bread and learning to live, and while she did down below, every cruel thing she'd predicted had come true, exactly as she'd said it would. And there'd been no one down there to remember she'd said it, because Amos Prentice had made sure the only witness who could count was a dead crazy woman frozen in the peaks. He did it, she whispered. He actually did it. I told them. I stood in that shop and I told them and they laughed and he did it. He did the whole thing. Ma'am, I have to go down. Margaret was already moving, already turning toward the shelter, toward the rifle, toward Ruth. I have to go down there right now. I have to tell them. I have to. Mrs. Whitmore. Caleb caught her arm the first time he'd touched her, and he did it gentle, and he let go the second she stopped. You can't. Not now. The passes are shut. The one you came up is a death trap. Now you know that better than me. You damn near died getting up it. And even if you got down, you're a dead crazy widow, ma'am. That's what the whole valley knows. You walk into Silver Creek right now and start shouting that the banker planned it all. You know what happens. They lock you up or worse, and Prentice thanks him for it, and he finishes the job, and this time there's no story he even has to make up. You said it yourself back in that lean-to. Nobody's going to believe you, not without proof. Margaret stopped. She stood there breathing hard and slowly. Slowly the truth of what he'd said settled over the fire in her chest, and banked it into something lower and hotter and far more dangerous than panic. Proof, she said. Proof, Caleb agreed. The kind a judge can't wave off. The kind that hangs a man in a real court, not a mountaintop. He was watching her, and there was something in his eyes now that had not been there when he rode out of the timber, respect, and something more than respect. Something that was starting to look like the beginnings of a decision. I've got no love for Amos Prentice, ma'am. Man tried to buy my sweetgrass grazing 2 years back with paper I didn't like the smell of, and I ran him off my land. And I've got 11 head of cattle can wait, and I've got a strong back and a good horse and no wife nor kin to answer to, and I find I've got a powerful sudden interest in a widow that isn't dead and a banker that thinks she is. He set his jaw. So I'll ask you plain. You want help getting that proof? Because I reckon between your head for figures and my knowing every soul and every trail in that valley, we might just... Why? Margaret said. Caleb stopped. Ma'am, why would you do that? She searched his face hard, the old wariness flaring up one last time, because kindness from strangers was the one thing in this world she had never learned to trust, having gotten so little of it. You don't know me. You lost cattle you can't afford. You've got every reason to warm your hands and ride on and let the mad widow and the crooked banker fight it out without you. Men don't do a thing like this for a woman they met an hour ago. Not without a reason. So what's your reason, Caleb Walker? What is it you want? For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he set his half loaf down on the stone careful, and he took his hat off, the first time he'd bared his head, and he held it in his big frostbit hands, and he looked at her with something working behind his weathered face that she couldn't read. You said something before, he said quietly. When you were telling me about your husband, You said he died in a mine, holding up a beam, so 3 younger men could get out under his arms. He turned the hat in his hands. You said his name was Thomas Whitmore. I did. Margaret's voice had gone strange. Why? Caleb Walker looked at her, and his own voice, when it came, was not steady anymore. Because I was one of them, ma'am, he said. I was one of the 3. I was 26 years old and green as grass, and working that shaft to grubstake my first cattle, and the roof came in, and there was a beam, and there was a big quiet miner, nobody knew real well, who got his shoulders under it and held. And he held it, ma'am. He held it while 3 of us crawled out under his arms one by one, and he was still holding it when the rest of it came down. He had to stop. When he went on, it was barely above a whisper. I never knew his name till just now. Nobody did. We tried to find out after us 3 who it was that saved us, and all anybody could tell us was some miner named Whitmore, and that he'd left a widow, and that she'd gone to work in a bakery, and that was all. I sent money to that bakery, anonymous twice a year every year, for a man whose face I saw for about 10 seconds in the dark and never forgot. His jaw worked. Grayson's Bakery, Silver Creek. I've been sending it to Grayson's Bakery for 2 years, thinking some of it might reach Thomas Whitmore's widow. Margaret stood absolutely still. I never got it, she said. Not a penny of it. Not once. And she watched Caleb Walker understand where 2 years of his money had gone into the pocket of a drunk who'd thrown her apron in the snow, and she watched his weathered face go from grief to something else entirely. Something cold and level and final. He put his hat back on. Ma'am, he said, I came up this mountain looking for 11 head of cattle, and I found the widow of the man that gave me my whole life back alive, when the whole country thinks she's dead, thrown away by a town that stole the very money I sent to keep her fed. He looked at her, and there was no wariness left in her to answer it, because there was no wariness left in him. I'm not going anywhere. Not till Amos Prentice and Walter Grayson answer for every last piece of it. That's not a favor, Mrs. Whitmore. That's a debt. It's the oldest one I've got, and I aim to pay it. The wind came down off the peaks and went clean over the top of the fold, the way it always did, and did not touch them. And Margaret Whitmore, standing beside her own oven with half a loaf of bread in her hand and a dead man's tin star over her heart, looked at the one man in all the frozen world who owed his life to the husband she'd buried, and understood that the mountain hadn't taken her after all. It had been keeping her, for this. They did not sleep that night. They planned. Margaret sat across the oven's mouth from Caleb Walker, with Thomas's notebook open on her knees, and the fire throwing its heat between them, and she laid it out the way she'd once laid out a ledger, line by line, nothing wasted. If I walk into Silver Creek and say the banker planned it, she said, I lose. You told me that yourself, and you're right. So we don't say it. We prove it. And to prove it in a court that'll hang a man like Prentice, I need 3 things. She held up one flour-scarred finger. I need the paper. The real ledger, the one I did on his drunk Fridays, that shows Grayson's flour was bought on the bank's credit, which means the roof coming down cost Walter nothing and cost the town everything. That's motive in ink. That's at the bank, Caleb said. Or the bakery. It's in the bakery. Bottom drawer of the desk in the back, under a false board Walter thinks nobody knows about. I know about it because I'm the one that added the columns. A second finger came up. Second thing, I need a witness. A living person who'll stand up in a courtroom and swear they heard me warn Walter Grayson about that roof to his face and heard him laugh. Because a court can argue about a ledger. It can't argue about a dozen people who watched a widow get thrown in the snow for telling the truth. You've got a whole town of those, Caleb said grimly. Question is whether one of them's got the spine to say it out loud with Prentice holding their mortgage. One of them does. Margaret thought of a thin woman with a wedge of cheese. Maybe 2. A third finger. And the last thing. The thing that turns this from a sad accident into a crime with a rope at the end of it. She closed the notebook. I need to know how that roof came down. Caleb frowned. You know how it came down. You told me. Green timber freeze and thaw the beams split. The beams were splitting, Margaret said. Slow. That's the thing that's been eating at me since you told me it fell. Split timber sags for weeks before it lets go. It groans. It drops dust. It gives warning after warning after warning, I know, because I read the warnings for 2 months. A roof like that doesn't just come down all at once in a single night. She leaned toward the fire, and her voice dropped. Unless somebody helped it. Unless somebody wanted to be sure it came down when they said, and not a week early or a week late, because the whole scheme only works if the flour's ruined at the exact moment the pass is shut and folks can't get out to buy grain anywhere else. She looked at him. You don't leave a thing that important to weather, Caleb. Not if you're Amos Prentice. You make certain. The wind went over the top of the fold. You're saying somebody cut it, Caleb said slowly. I'm saying if somebody cut it, it'll show. Wood that breaks under weight tears, it's got long splinters. It's ugly. It fights all the way down. Wood that's been sawed and then loaded till it snaps has a clean face where the saw went and a torn face where it finally broke. And any man who's ever felled a tree can read the difference in about 2 seconds. She tapped the notebook. Thomas has 3 pages on it. I could read those beams like a Bible. But I have to get to them before the spring melt buries the wreckage, or Prentice thinks to haul it off and burn it. She met Caleb's eyes across the fire. Which means I have to go down. To the bakery. To what's left of it. The passes are shut. You came up. I came up a man's trail that near killed a man. Caleb shook his head. Ma'am, I'll go. I'll go down. I'll get your ledger. I'll find your witness, and I'll get to those beams, and I'll look at 'em, and I'll tell you every splinter. You don't know wood the way I do. Then you'll teach me tonight, and I'll— No. Margaret said it flat, and something in the way she said it stopped him. I've spent 2 months up here, staying alive because a whole town decided I was too big and too poor, and too much of a woman to be worth listening to. And you know what I have decided, Caleb Walker, sitting on this mountain? Her jaw set. I have decided I am done sending other people to speak for me. That roof came down on my warning. Those are my beams. That's my town, whatever they did to me. And there are children down there going hungry because nobody would hear a fat widow, and I will be damned before I sit up here safe and warm and send a man to do my telling for me. I'm going down that mountain. You can help me or you can watch me, but you can't stop me. So let's not waste the dark arguing. Caleb Walker looked at her a long moment. And then slow, he did a thing that no man in Silver Creek had ever done in her whole life. He nodded. All right, he said. Then we go together, and God help Amos Prentice. They went down 2 days later, when the sky cleared enough to risk it, and the descent was worse than the climb, because a mountain that grudges you going up will try to kill you coming down. Twice Margaret went to her knees on ice she couldn't see. Once a whole shelf of snow let go under Ruth, and they lost 50 feet of hard-won trail in a roar of white, and Margaret rode it down on her backside with the rifle held over her head and her heart in her mouth, and came to rest against a deadfall with her leg wrenched and her breath gone, and Caleb was there hauling her up before she'd finished falling. You hurt. I've been hurt worse by a bread oven, she gasped. Keep moving. We lose the light. We lose the weak. Halfway down on a slope of bare, wind-scoured ice, Ruth balked at a chute that fell away steep into the dark, and no amount of coaxing would move her. And Margaret stood arguing with a mule on the side of a mountain in the cold, and understood all at once that the animal was right. She won't take it, Caleb said. And she's smarter than both of us for it. That chute's a slide waiting to happen. Then we go around. It costs us an hour. It cost us more than an hour if you go down it, and I have to carry you the rest of the way with a broke leg. Caleb caught her arm as she started to argue. Ma'am, I have watched you climb a mountain goat would think twice about. I am not questioning your grit. I'm asking you to trust an old mule and a man who's buried friends that trusted their grit over the ice. We go around. Margaret looked at him a long moment. And then, for maybe the first time in 2 years, she let another person's judgment stand over her own will, and something in her chest loosened at how it did not cost her a thing to do it. We go around, she agreed. Lead on, Mr. Walker. They reached the timber below the snow line as the second night came on, and there Caleb made her stop. "From here I go ahead," he said. "You wait in the trees. I mean it this time, ma'am. And it's not about your spine, it's about your face. You show it in daylight. Word gets to Prentice inside the hour, and he'll have that wreckage burned and your witness scared silent before you've warmed your hands. Let me go in first. Let me find out who's still got a backbone. Then I come back for you after dark, and we do the rest together. Can you give me that?" It cost her, but it was sense, and she'd sworn off letting fear or pride outrun sense. "Go," she said. "But Caleb, find Hattie Abernathy, and find a girl named Ellie Dobbs, the sheriff's granddaughter. You tell that child the northwest sky finally made good. She'll know what it means." Her voice caught. "And you be careful. I have got exactly one man in this world who owes me nothing and helps me anyway, and I'd take it hard to lose him." Something moved in Caleb's weathered face at that. He didn't answer it. He just touched his hat brim and turned his horse, and rode down into the town that thought she was dead. What Caleb found in Silver Creek was worse than either of them had let themselves imagine. The Cooper place had a foreclosure notice nailed to the door and no smoke in the chimney. Sam Cooper, the boy who'd stood up in the bakery and been sat back down with the mention of a debt, was gone. Moved in with cousins 2 valleys over, and the land his father had broken with his own hands for 20 years belonged now to the bank. Down the row of it in house after house, Caleb saw the same thing through the same frosted windows. Families spooning out the last of the meal, a pinch at a time. Children with the gray-pinched look he'd seen on cattle drives in the killing winters, and every one of those homes with a paper coming due it couldn't pay. And moving through all of it, house to house in a warm coat with clean hands, came Amos Prentice. Patient, kind, so terribly, terribly kind. Caleb stood in the shadow of the mercantile porch and watched the banker's buggy pull up outside the Halloran farmhouse, and he watched Prentice go up the walk with a satchel under his arm, and because the window was cracked against the cook stove heat, he heard every word. "Now, Josiah, I didn't come here to press you," Prentice was saying, gentle as a preacher. "A man's got his pride, I understand that. But your little ones, how old's the youngest now?" 4, 5, and no bread in the house, and the passes shut till April. A pause. "I've got a wagon of good milled flour sitting at the bank. It's yours tonight. You'd be feeding those babies by morning. And what do you want for it?" Josiah Halloran's voice was flat with exhaustion and shame. "Only your signature, a trifle. Just putting the North Quarter up as security so the books are square. You'll pay it back come the good years, and if you can't—" A rustle of paper soft as a snake in grass. "Well, we won't borrow trouble tonight. Sign here, and let's get those children fed." Caleb heard the scratch of the pen. He heard a man sign away, land his grandchildren would never walk. He heard a hungry 4-year-old somewhere in that house ask if there was going to be bread, and he heard the child's mother, thick-voiced, say, "Yes, baby. Yes, there's going to be bread now." He had to put his hand flat against the mercantile wall and hold there a moment before he could trust himself to move. Then he went to find the living. Hattie Abernathy was behind the counter of her husband's failing store. And when Caleb leaned in close and said the name Whitmore low, she dropped a jar of preserves that burst on the floorboards in a red ruin and stood staring at him white as flour. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't you say that name to me. Margaret's dead. Everybody knows she's alive," Caleb said. "She's up the mountain right now, and she's coming down tonight, and she remembers a woman who brought her a wedge of cheese and some salt pork when the whole town wouldn't look at her. She remembers a promise that woman made in a livery lean-to, about telling the truth when the roof came down." He held Hattie's frightened eyes. "It came down, just like she swore it would. And she wants to know, ma'am, did you mean it?" For a moment, Hattie couldn't speak at all. Her hand had gone to her mouth, and above it, her eyes had filled, and Caleb watched 2 months of guilt and grief and swallowed shame come up in a woman who'd thought she'd never get the chance to spend it. "I have prayed," Hattie said when she could. "Every night since December. I have prayed for a chance to make it right and told myself there'd never be one, that she was gone, and I'd carry it to my grave." She took her hand from her mouth and her thin chin came up, and something steadied in her that had been shaking a long time. "You tell her I meant every word. You tell her Hattie Abernathy will stand up in any courtroom in this territory and swear on the book that Walter Grayson threw that woman in the snow for telling him the truth, and that I watched and did nothing, and I have hated myself for it every day since. I'll say it out loud. Finally. Tell her that." The sheriff was the hardest, and Caleb saved him for last, because a man never knows till he tries which way a frightened man will break when he's finally pushed hard enough to break it all. Caleb found Dobbs alone in his office, shut the door behind him, and laid it out with no softening. The Whitmore widow was alive. She had proof the bakery didn't fall by accident, and Amos Prentice was buying up the whole valley, one starving family at a time, exactly the way she'd said he would. Dobbs heard him out without a word. Then the old man sat with his hands flat on the desk and his head down, and Caleb watched the war go on inside him. The 11 years of fear against whatever decent thing was left underneath, and for one long bad moment, Caleb was certain the fear was going to win the way it had won in this town, every single time it mattered. "You know what he holds over me," Dobbs said at last, not looking up. "Prentice, the note on the jail, the roof over my house. My whole life's on his books, same as everybody's. A man stands up to him, he loses everything by Friday." "I know it," Caleb said. "I'm an old man. I got nothing but that little house and that girl." "That girl," Caleb said quietly, "is why I came to you last, Sheriff. Because Ms. Whitmore told me to. She said to find you and tell you the northwest sky finally made good. Said your granddaughter would know what it meant." Dobbs went very still. "Ellie," he said. His voice had gone rough. "She cried a solid week when the widow left. Wouldn't eat. Sat in the window watching the mountains like she was waiting on a falling star to come back up the sky." His hands flat on the desk had begun to shake, but not with fear now. "And I told her to stop. I told a 9-year-old child to give up hoping, because giving up was easier for a coward than doing one brave thing." He pushed to his feet and reached for his hat, and his old hands had gone steady as stone. "Mister, I have been afraid of Amos Prentice for 11 years, and I have let it cost me every ounce of my self-respect. I am done paying that price tonight." He settled the hat on his head. "Where do you want me?" Caleb came back up into the timber after full dark, and Margaret rose out of the trees like a ghost, and he told her all of it, the foreclosures, the hungry children, Hattie's promise, the sheriff's turning. And Margaret listened, and her face in the dark went through grief and fury, and something harder than both, and at the end, she said only one thing. "Then let's go read some beams." The ruined bakery stood at the dark end of the street where nobody went anymore, a heap of fallen timber and snow-crushed roof, and Margaret Whitmore knelt in the wreckage of the place that had thrown her away and did by feel and by lantern light the one thing she could do that no one else in the territory could. She read the wood. Caleb held the lantern low and shielded so its glow wouldn't reach the street, and Margaret went down on her knees in the crushed and fallen timber of the place that had thrown her away, and she began to run her scarred hands along the beams one at a time, the way Thomas had taught her by the fire 100 nights ago. "Talk to me," Caleb murmured, "so I know what you're looking at." When wood breaks honest under weight, it was never meant to hold it fights. Her fingers moved over a splintered end. "Feel that. Long slivers all torn out one direction, rough as a cat's tongue. That's a beam that did its level best and lost. That's an accident. This one's honest." She moved to the next. "This one too. And this." Her hands went faster now, beam to beam, and Caleb heard the fear creeping back into her voice. The fear that she was wrong, that it really had been weather and rot and bad luck, that she'd dragged this good man down a killing mountain to kneel in rubble and find nothing. "Honest, honest, come on. Come on, where are you?" "Margaret." "They can't all be honest," she said low and fierce, more to herself than to him. "If they're all honest, then it was an accident, then Prentice just got lucky. Then I've got no crime, just a sad story nobody has to believe. It has to be here. He had to make sure. A man like that doesn't trust the weather with a fortune he wouldn't, Her hand stopped. She had reached the great center beam, the spine of the whole flower room roof. The one that had to fail before anything else could. And the moment her fingers found the brake, her whole body went rigid. "Here," she breathed. "Caleb, bring the light." "Here." He brought it. And in the yellow lantern glow they both looked at the great center beam, the one that had held the whole flower room roof, and even Caleb, who knew wood only the way any rancher knows, it could see it plain once she pointed. Half the beam's break was torn long and splintered and ugly the way wood tears when weight finally beats it. And the other half, the deep half where the failure had started, was smooth, clean, flat as a tabletop with the parallel lines of saw teeth still standing in the grain. "Somebody cut it," Caleb said softly. "Somebody cut it near through and left just enough to hold till the snow load finished it." "2/3 through," Margaret said, and her voice shook, not with fear now, but with a cold, singing certainty. "A man could climb up on a still night with a bucksaw and cut it 2/3 through in an hour, and it'd hold a day a week till the first heavy snow came and put the last straw on it right on schedule right when the passes shut." She sat back on her heels. "This isn't a roof that fell, Caleb. This is a murdered roof, and I can prove it to any judge in the territory." "Then let's get it out of here before—" "Well now," said a soft voice from the dark. "The mad widow. Back from the grave after all." Margaret's whole body went to ice. Amos Prentice stood at the edge of the wreckage with a lantern of his own and 2 men behind him. Hard men, hired men, not Silver Creek faces, and a small pistol held loose and comfortable in one clean pink hand. Beside him, half a step back and sweating despite the cold, stood Walter Grayson. "I confess I did not believe it," Prentice said, picking his way closer, unhurried. "When Halloran's boy came running to tell me a big woman and a cattleman were poking through my late bakery by lantern light, I thought surely not. Surely the mountain took her as the mountain takes everyone foolish enough." His pale eyes flicked to the cut beam, and for just a second, the softness in him faltered, to go where they don't belong. "You cut the beam," Margaret said. "I did nothing at all," Prentice said pleasantly. "I am a banker. I sit at a desk. I sign papers. Whatever happened to this unfortunate roof, I'm sure I couldn't say." His eyes moved to Grayson, and there was something ugly and warning in them. "Could you, Walter?" "I never," Grayson's voice cracked. "I only did what you told me you said it'd hold till—" "Walter." Prentice did not raise his voice. He never did. "Be quiet." But Margaret had heard it. Caleb had heard it. And in the dark at the edge of the wreckage, 3 more people who had come quiet through the alleys had heard it too. Because while Prentice talked, Sheriff Dobbs had come up on one side with his hand on his gun, and Hattie Abernathy on the other, and behind them wide-eyed a girl who should have been in bed and had slipped out the way she always did, a girl with a lucky star she'd given away and a hope she'd never once let go. "Ellie," the sheriff hissed. "Ellie, get back!" But the child had already seen her. "Miss Whitmore." The cry rang down the dead street, and Margaret's heart broke and healed in the same instant, and Prentice's head snapped around, and for one crucial second, the banker's careful world tipped, because a scheme that runs on a town believing a woman is dead cannot survive a 9-year-old screaming her living name into the night. "You see, Mr. Prentice?" Margaret said, rising slowly to her full height in the lantern light, and she was a big woman, and she let herself be every inch of it. "That's the trouble with a story. You have to get everyone to believe it. And you never could get Ellie Dobbs to believe I was dead, because she's got more sense than every grown man in this valley, and she's been watching the northwest sky for my smoke since December." She took a step toward him over the wreckage. "And now, here's her grandfather, the sheriff, standing right beside you. And here's Hattie Abernathy, who's going to swear in any court in the territory that she watched Walter Grayson throw my apron in the snow when I warned him about this exact roof. And here's a cut beam with the saw marks still in it. And here's you holding a pistol on a widow in front of the law." Her voice rang. "So I'll ask you the question you asked me, Mr. Prentice, that day in the snow. How do you suppose this ends?" "It ends," Hattie Abernathy said, and her voice shook and did not stop. with me telling every soul in this valley what I watched you and Walter Grayson do to a decent woman. I've been quiet 2 months, Amos. I'm done being quiet." "Hattie," Prentice said, turning that soft, dangerous face on her, "your husband owes this bank $400. Then take the store." Hattie's chin came up. "Take it. I'd rather live in a tent and look my own children in the eye than keep one more thing I bought with my silence. And the collapse," Sheriff Dobbs said, stepping into the lantern light with his hand steady on his gun, "is a matter for the law now. Amos, and I'm the law, whatever paper you hold on me. There's a beam here with saw marks in it. That's not weather. That's a crime, and I aim to see it answered, and if you want my badge, you'll have to take it off me in front of witnesses." For one heartbeat, something flickered behind the banker's pale eyes. The first crack Margaret had ever seen in him, the dawning understanding of a man who had built his whole kingdom on everyone being too afraid to speak, watching them speak anyway, one after another in the ruins of his own crime. Then the crack closed, and what was underneath it was worse than anything that had been on top. Prentice's soft face had gone very still, and then it did the thing that cornered men's faces do. It stopped pretending. "It ends," he said quietly, "the way things end for people who can't pay." The pistol came up no longer loose, no longer comfortable, leveled square at Margaret's chest. "I hold the paper on every soul in this valley, Sheriff, and that includes the note on your jail and the roof over your granddaughter's head. You draw that gun, you're not a lawman, you're a debtor in default, and these 2 gentlemen behind me will explain the difference." His thumb drew back the hammer, and the click of it was very loud. The widow died in the mountains. That's the story. It's a good story. And a dead woman can't read beams or count ledgers or say one single word in any court anywhere. He looked at Margaret over the barrel, and the last of the softness was gone, and what was left was just the cold arithmetic of a man who had decided a life was cheaper than the truth. "You should have taken the warm room, Mrs. Whitmore." "Maybe," Margaret said. She did not step back. She did not flinch. She had faced this man down once already unarmed in the snow, and she had learned up on that mountain exactly how much she could bear and keep standing. "But I'll tell you what you should have done, Amos. You should have made sure I was the only one who could read that beam." Prentice frowned, and Caleb Walker, who had eased sideways into the dark, while every eye in that wreckage was fixed on the pistol, and the widow spoke from 6 feet to the banker's left, close enough that the 2 hired men whirled far too late, close enough that the rifle he'd carried up and down that mountain was already at his shoulder and already trained. "Put it down," Caleb said. Prentice froze. "I'm not a banker, Mr. Prentice," Caleb said low and even. "I don't sit at a desk. I've spent 20 years in country that'd kill you between breakfast and noon, and I have never once in my life pointed this rifle at a man I wasn't willing to shoot. You've got a pistol on the widow of Thomas Whitmore, and you're going to take it off her right now real slow, or these good people are going to watch me do a thing I'll answer to God for and not lose a wink of sleep. I owe that woman's dead husband my life. There is nothing on this earth you can threaten me with that weighs against that debt." His voice never rose. "Put it down. I won't say it a third time." For one long, terrible heartbeat, nobody in the ruins of the bakery moved. And then Walter Grayson broke. "For God's sake, Amos, put it down." The bakery owner's nerve had finally shattered, all his cruelty run out of him, leaving only a frightened man and a collapsing lie. "It's over. Don't you see? It's over. There's the sheriff and the whole... I'm not hanging for you. You hear me? I'm not. You said the roof. You said just cut it enough and let the snow do the rest and nobody'd ever. But she read it. She read the beam. It's over." "Walter," Prentice said, and there was death in it. "I cut it." Grayson screamed it into the night to the sheriff, to Hattie, to the child, to anyone, everyone. He paid me to cut it. He said we'd buy the valley cheap and split it and nobody'd know. And he made me do the roof, and he stole the money that cowboy sent for the widow. All of it, 2 years of it, straight into his own. I'll swear to it. I'll swear to all of it. Just get that gun off me, Amos. It's done. And there it was. The confession screamed by the one man Prentice had trusted to keep it in front of the sheriff of Silver Creek. in the wreckage of the crime itself, with the cut beam lying between them and the saw marks shining in the lantern light. Amos Prentice looked at Walter Grayson. Then he looked at the rifle, 6 feet to his left, held rock steady by a man who owed a dead miner everything. Then he looked at Margaret Whitmore, the widow he had told twice would be dead by February, standing whole and unbroken and terrible in the ruins of the bakery that was supposed to have buried her. And Amos Prentice made the last calculation of the only kind of man he'd ever known how to be. His pistol swung off Margaret's chest, fast toward the one person whose voice could still hang him toward Walter Grayson, and the night came apart in noise. 2 shots. So close together, they were almost one. The first was Prentice's swung off Margaret and onto Walter Grayson, the one voice that could hang him, and it caught the bakery owner high in the shoulder and spun him down into the wreckage, screaming. The second was Caleb's. He did not shoot to kill. Margaret understood that later, turning it over, understood that a man who'd carried a rifle 20 years and never once fired it at someone he wasn't willing to kill had made a choice in the space of a heartbeat that most men couldn't have made in an hour. Because Amos Prentice dead was Amos Prentice escaped, gone to whatever the next world does, with men like him, and Amos Prentice alive was Amos Prentice in a courtroom. So Caleb put his bullet through the banker's gun hand, and the little pistol went spinning off into the dark, and Prentice folded over his ruined fingers, with a high, thin sound that was almost worse than a scream, because it was the sound of a man who had never once in his soft life felt real pain, discovering all at once what it was. Guns down. Dobbs was roaring, and his own was up now, and steady 11 years of fear burned clean off him. "You 2 hired men, you want to hang for a banker that just shot his own partner? Guns down, or so help me." For one held breath, it could have gone either way. Then the taller of the 2 hired men looked at Prentice folded over his hand in the dirt, and looked at the sheriff's steady gun, and looked at the big cattleman already levering a fresh round, and he did the arithmetic that Prentice had taught the whole valley to do. He counted the cost, and he came up with an answer the banker wouldn't have liked. "Wasn't our roof?" he said, and dropped his pistol in the snow. "We just got hired to look mean. We ain't dying for it." The second man bolted, just turned and ran into the dark, and nobody chased him because he was nobody. And there were bigger things in that wreckage than one hired coward running for the timber. And through all of it, the shots, the shouting, the guns, coming down a 9-year-old girl had been running, and Margaret had moved without thinking. The instant the first shot cracked, thrown her own big body over the child, and taken her down into the snow behind a fallen beam, and covered her whole. Now in the ringing quiet after, Margaret felt the small shape shaking underneath her, and she pulled back just enough to see Ellie Dobbs' face, white and huge-eyed, but whole, unhurt, alive. "You're all right," Margaret breathed. "You hear me? Ellie, you're all right. You're not hurt. I've got you." "You came back," the child sobbed into her collar. "You came back. I told them. I told everybody. I said there'd be smoke. I said you'd come back." "I know you did." Margaret's own voice broke clean in half. "I know you did, baby. You were the only one that never stopped believing it. And here I am." She held the child hard against the tin star that hung over her heart, the child's own star given away at the edge of town, in a blizzard come back down the mountain, against a widow's breastbone. Here I am. It was over that fast. 2 shots and a bolted coward and a banker crying over his hand in the ruins of his own crime, and 11 years of Amos Prentice's grip on Silver Creek was finished. Though the finishing of it, Margaret would learn before the night was out, was not nearly so simple as a man with a ruined hand. They got Grayson's bleeding stopped. Hattie did it of all people, tearing her own petticoat into strips and packing the shoulder, while the bakery owner wept and babbled. And Margaret watched the thin, frightened woman, who had once done nothing but watch, now kneel in the snow, with her hands red to the wrist, saving the life of a man she despised because she had decided somewhere in the last 2 months that she was done being the kind of person who only watched. And Grayson talked. Lord, how he talked. Wounded men and cornered men and men who finally run out of lies all talk the same way in a flood, and it poured out of Walter Grayson into the freezing dark, with the sheriff writing it down by lantern light, and Hattie and Caleb standing witness. The whole rotten shape of it. How Prentice had come to him 2 years back when the bakery was failing and Walter was drowning in drink and debt. How the banker had offered a way out, not just out, but rich. Buy the flour on the bank's credit. Let the roof come down at the right moment. Starve the town just enough, just long enough that folks would sign anything for grain. Buy the whole valley for pennies on the dollar, and split it banker and baker, and let the widow, the one person who could read the books and read the beams, freeze up in the mountains where nobody would ever ask a question. And the money, Margaret said quietly when Grayson wound down. She'd been waiting for it. Tell them about the money, Walter. The money that came for me. Grayson wouldn't look at her. There was a fellow, he mumbled. Sent money, twice a year. For the Whitmore widow, the letters said, anonymous, come through the mail addressed to the bakery. His voice dropped to almost nothing. Prentice took it, every dollar. Said a dead man's charity was wasted on a woman that'd never miss it. Said what's she going to do, complain to the post office? He finally looked up, and his face was gray with pain and shame. I never gave you a cent of it, Margaret. 2 years. I'm sorry. God, Save it, Margaret said. She was not cruel about it. She was just done. Save your sorry for the judge. He'll want to hear it more than I do. And that was when Amos Prentice, cradling his shattered hand against his chest, lifted his gray face out of the dark and started unbelievably to laugh. It was a terrible sound, low and wet and certain. A judge, he said. Yes, by all means. Let's talk about the judge. He got himself up onto his knees in the wreckage, and even now, even ruined, there was something in him that made the hair stand up on Margaret's arms, the pure, unbending arrogance of a man who has never once been made to lose. You have a confession from a baker who will say anything to keep from hanging. You have a beam that a jury of ranchers might read your way or might not, and you have a great deal of feeling. His pale eyes found Margaret's. But you do not have my land, Mrs. Whitmore. Do you understand that every deed I hold was signed, freely, witnessed, legal? Josiah Halloran put his own name to that paper with his own hand. There's not a court in this territory can unmake a signature a man gave willingly for value received. I gave them grain. They gave me land. That's not a crime. That's commerce. He smiled through the pain, and it was ghastly. You can put me in a cell. You cannot put the valley back. Those farms are mine legally forever, and there is nothing a hungry widow and a cowboy and a broken-down sheriff can do about it. The silence that followed was the worst of the whole night, because he was right. Margaret felt the rightness of it land on the little band of them in the wreckage like a second collapse. They had won the fight and lost the war. Prentice would go to a cell, maybe for the shooting for the roof. But the land, the homes, the whole future of the valley he'd stolen, all of it, wrapped up legal and tight in signatures given by desperate men who'd sign again tomorrow to feed their children. You couldn't unsign a deed. Halloran had signed. They'd all signed. He's right, Hattie whispered stricken. Margaret, the land's gone. It's really gone. They signed. He's right about the territory, Margaret said slowly. Something in her voice made Prentice's smile falter. He's right that there's not a court in the territory can unmake it. Margaret rose to her feet in the wreckage, and she was thinking now fast, the way she thought over a column of figures that didn't add up, chasing the one line that would make it balance. But you made a mistake tonight, Amos. Grayson just made it for you, and you were too busy gloating to catch it. She turned to the sheriff. The money. Caleb's money that came for me. How did it come? Through the mail, Dobbs said. Grayson just said. Come through the mail addressed to the bakery. Through the United States mail, Margaret said. And Amos Prentice took it out and put it in his own pocket. Every dollar. Twice a year for 2 years. She looked at Caleb, and she watched him catch it the same instant she had watched the understanding light his weathered face. That's not the territory's business, Amos. That's not a signature a desperate man gave you. That's the federal government's mail opened and stolen, and stealing out of the U.S. mail is a federal crime, and it doesn't go to a circuit judge you can lean on or a jury of your own debtors." Her voice rang out clear in the ruined dark. "It goes to a United States Marshal, a man who lives 300 miles from here, who never borrowed a dime from you, who doesn't care one particle whose paper you hold. You own this valley, Amos, I'll grant you that. But you do not own the United States of America. And once a marshal's got you for mail theft, once he's got a reason to come out here and open your books and turn over every deal you ever made in the dark, how long do you reckon those legal, freely signed witness deeds hold up when a federal man starts asking exactly what a family was starving for when they signed them?" Amos Prentice stopped smiling. For the first time since she had known him, since the snow, since the warm room, since "You'll be dead by February." Margaret Whitmore watched real fear come into the banker's soft face and stay there. "You've got nothing," he said, but the certainty had gone out of it. "You can't prove. I can prove you took the mail. Grayson just swore to it, and he'll swear to it again to a marshal, and so will you when they offer to let you keep your neck for it." Margaret stepped close and looked down at him, and there was no triumph in her face, only a great and final tiredness. "You should have laughed at me, Amos. Back in that snow. A guilty man threatens, an innocent man laughs. You never once in all of this could bring yourself to just laugh at the fat widow and let her go. And that's what hangs you. Not my beam, not Walter's mouth. Your own certainty that I was worth being afraid of." She turned away from him. "Sheriff, lock him up. Lock them both up. And come the thaw, send your fastest rider for a marshal, and tell him to bring a man who can read a ledger, because I've got 2 years of them memorized, and I will testify to every single line." They took Prentice away in the dark, and the last thing Margaret heard of him was the soft, broken sound of a man doing arithmetic that would not, for the first time in his life, come out in his favor. There was one more thing she had come down that mountain to get, and she got it before she let herself feel anything at all. She went to the wreckage of the back room where the desk had stood, and she dug through the fallen timber and the snow-wet plaster with her bare hands, until she found it, the desk crushed but whole in the middle, its drawers sprung. She hauled the bottom drawer clear and set her fingers into a seam that no one who hadn't put ledgers there would ever have found, and she lifted the false board out. Underneath, wrapped in the oilcloth she'd wrapped it in herself on a drunken Friday 2 years gone, was the ledger. "Bring the light," she said, and Caleb brought it, and Margaret opened the book to a page she could have found blind and turned it so the sheriff could see. There, Grayson's flour, every sack of it bought on the bank's line of credit, Prentice's own hand countersigning the note, which means Walter never owned a grain of it and never stood to lose a cent when it was ruined. Her finger moved down the column, and there, the deposits that never balanced. Twice a year, 2 years running, a sum comes into the bank's account with no name against it and goes straight back out into Prentice's private book the same day. That's Caleb's money. That's the mail he stole, written in his own bookkeeping, because a man that arrogant never once believed anybody'd live to read it. She closed the book and held it to her chest like she'd held the starter up the mountain. Now we've got the ink to go with the beam and the mouth. Now it doesn't matter what Prentice says. It's all here. It was always all here. It just needed somebody left alive who could read it. Dobbs let out a long breath. "You memorized all that 2 years back." "Numbers don't leave me, Sheriff," Margaret said. "Kindness. Now kindness. I've had so little of. I remember every scrap. But numbers I've got by the bushel." She tucked the ledger inside her coat next to the tin star. "Nobody touches this book but me till the marshal comes. It's the only one of its kind, and I've got the only head that can read what it means." But the marshal was 300 miles and a shut mountain pass away, and that was the thing that turned Margaret's whole night around and pointed it at the one true crisis that no confession or federal law could touch. Because when the fight was over, and the villains were in the jail, and the little band of them stood in the wreckage breathing hard, Ellie Dobbs tugged at Margaret's coat and asked in the small voice of a child who has learned not to expect much, the question that mattered more than all the rest of it put together. "Miss Whitmore, is there going to be bread now?" And Margaret looked down at the child, really looked at the thinness of her, at the pinch in her cheeks that hadn't been there in December, at the whole hungry valley standing behind that one small question, and she understood that catching Amos Prentice had solved nothing at all about the thing that actually mattered. The grain was still locked in the bank. The flour was still ruined under the snow. The passes were still shut. Justice was coming with the thaw, but the children were hungry now tonight, and a marshal 300 miles off could not put one loaf in one child's hands. "Ellie," Margaret said, "how long since you had bread? Real bread?" The girl thought about it. "Christmas," she said. "There was a little at Christmas." It was near the end of February. Margaret stood there in the cold, and something rose up in her that was bigger than the fury, and bigger than the grief. The thing she'd carried up the mountain in a crock against her heart. The thing that had come down through 3 generations of hard women unbroken. The one thing she had never once in her life not known how to do. "Then we'd best get to work," she said. "Caleb, how much can that horse of yours carry down a mountain?" Caleb Walker looked at her, and slow he began to understand, and slow the corner of his weathered mouth turned up. "Ma'am," he said, "you're not thinking of feeding the very town that threw you in the snow." "I'm thinking," Margaret said, "that there are children in it. And I never yet met a hungry child that deserved to pay for what grown cowards did." She was already moving, already turning her mind up the mountain to the oven she'd built, and the starter she'd kept, and the winter garden, and the smoked meat, and the sacks of grain she'd shot and snared and grown for one woman that could feed a good many more. "I've got an oven up there that can turn out 40 loaves a day if it's fired right. I've got a starter that's older than this whole territory. And I've got a mountain full of a thing this valley needs worse than it needs justice tonight." She looked at him. "You still owe a debt, Caleb Walker. Here's the first payment. You're going to help me carry bread down a mountain." It took them the rest of the night and half the next day to bring the first load down, and it near killed the horse and the mule both, and it was the beginning of the strangest and most beautiful stretch of Margaret Whitmore's whole life. They started with what she had already baked every loaf in her shelter wrapped in wool against the cold, hauled down the treacherous trail on Ruth's back, with Caleb walking ahead breaking snow. It went wrong the first day the way things do. On the worst pitch of the trail, Ruth's load shifted, and the mule scrambled, and a full sack of wrapped loaves went over the edge and down into a gully, 2 days of baking gone in a heartbeat, and Margaret nearly went after it before Caleb caught her by the back of her coat. "Let it go," he said. "You go down there after bread. I'm coming up this mountain with a widow-shaped hole in my heart and no widow. Let it go. We'll bake more. Those children. We'll eat tomorrow's baking instead of today's and be no worse for one day, and you'll be alive to make it." He held her eyes till she stopped straining toward the drop. "You spent all winter learning not to let fear outrun your sense. Don't unlearn it now over a sack of bread." She let it go. It was the hardest thing she'd done since she'd left the wages Walter owed her lying on his counter, and she did it, and they went on, and by nightfall, the first loaves were on Silver Creek's doorsteps. When that first baking was gone in a single afternoon, swallowed up by a valley that had been hungry for 2 months, they climbed back up and fired the oven and baked through the night. The 2 of them, Margaret at the peel and Caleb hauling wood and water, and they came down again with more. At first, the town did not know where the bread came from. That was the part Margaret hadn't planned and couldn't have. Caleb brought the first loaves to the Dobbs house and to the Hallorans and to the families with the smallest children, and he left them without a word, because Margaret had asked him to, not out of modesty, but because she wasn't ready, wasn't sure she could stand in front of the people who'd watched her go and not say something she'd regret. So for 3 days, warm bread simply appeared on doorsteps in Silver Creek in the dead of the worst winter in 20 years, and nobody knew who was leaving it, and the town began to whisper. Some said an angel, some said a ghost, the mad widow's ghost come back gentle. Some who had started to hear the truth trickling out of the jailhouse and the sheriff's office said a name they could barely believe and would not quite say out loud, because to say it was to admit what they had done. It was Ellie who ended it. The child had known, from the first loaf of course, had known the crack across the top and the sour tang and the way the bottom was baked through and never once burned. And on the 4th day, when a woman at the well said maybe it was a traveling preacher leaving the bread, Ellie Dobbs put her small hands on her hips in the middle of Silver Creek and said loud enough for the whole street to hear, "It's not a preacher, and it's not an angel, and it's not a ghost. It's Miss Whitmore, the one you all left in the snow. She's up the mountain baking bread and sending it down to feed you, and she doesn't even want you to know it's her because she's a better person than any of you, and I'm not sorry I said it." The well went quiet. And into that quiet, the truth of it came down on Silver Creek, at last all at once the way the roof had come down, the understanding of exactly what they had done and exactly what was being done back to them in return. They had thrown a woman away. And that woman was feeding their children. They came up the trail to find her the next morning. Not all of them, but a good many Josiah Halloran and the Reverend, and men who'd stood by the stove and laughed, and women who'd crossed the street. They came up as far as the snow line could be climbed, and they waited hats in their hands for the widow to come down with her bread. Margaret saw them from above, and near turned back. "I can't," she said to Caleb, and it was the closest she'd come to breaking in, all of it closer than the cliff, closer than the cold. "I can't go down there and face them. Not all of them at once. Standing there with their hats off like I'm something. 2 months ago, they watched me go, and not one of them." "You don't owe them a thing," Caleb said. "Not your face, not your bread, not one word. You want to turn around? We turn around, and I'll carry the loaves down myself, and you never have to look at a one of them." Margaret stood a long moment with the reins in her hand. "No," she said finally. "No. If I hide from them, then they get to keep believing the widow's some gentle ghost that forgave them from on high. And I didn't forgive them. Not all of them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that's my right." She squared her shoulders. "But those children have got to eat, and if the price of feeding them is standing in front of a town full of my own shame-made flesh, then I've paid worse prices this winter for less. Come on." She went down, and Silver Creek, which had watched her leave in silence, stood in silence again as she came back. But it was a different silence, and every soul in it knew the difference. She came down leading a mule loaded with bread, a big woman with a child's tin star at her throat, and a cattleman at her side, and she stopped in front of them, and for a moment nobody could find a word. It was the Reverend who found his. Reverend Pauling stepped forward, turning his hat in his hands, the way he'd once leaned on a broom, and his voice when it came was not the smooth pulpit voice at all. It shook. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I stood on those church steps and I told you I'd pray for you, and I sent you off to die because I was afraid, and I had 4 children, and I told myself that made it all right." He had to stop. "It didn't make it all right. My children watched me do it, just like you said. And now they've watched you come back down this mountain to feed them with your own hands after what I did." Tears stood in the man's eyes and did not fall. "I don't ask you to forgive me. I've no right to it. I only ask you to let me help carry the bread. Let an old coward do one honest thing before he dies." Margaret looked at him a long time. "You can carry bread, Reverend," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not the withholding of it either. It was something harder and more honest than both a door left open a crack no more. "Everybody eats. That's the only rule I've got. The ones who were kind to me and the ones who weren't, they all eat the same because I'll be damned if I turn this into what Prentice made of grain, a thing you give and take away to make people small." She lifted her chin and raised her voice so the whole gathered town could hear it. "You hear me, Silver Creek nobody up here is going to starve you into signing anything. Nobody's going to hold a loaf over your head. You come, you're hungry, you eat. That's all. That's the whole of it. That's what bread is supposed to be, and it's what it never should have stopped being. And if it takes the woman you threw away to remind you, well." Her voice cracked just once. "Here I am." Josiah Halloran began to weep openly, a big man standing hatless in the snow, and then another. And then it moved through the gathered crowd of them, like wind through wheat, the sound of a whole town's shame and gratitude coming up at once, and Margaret stood in front of it, and let it come, and did not soften, and did not gloat, and handed down the bread. That evening when the loaves were given out, and the crowd had gone back down to their homes with warm bread and warmer shame, Margaret and Caleb sat by the oven in the failing light, too tired to talk the good tiredness that comes of a thing done right. "You could have let them starve a while," Caleb said at last. Nobody would have blamed you. Lord knows I wouldn't have. No, Margaret agreed. But I'd have blamed me. She turned a loaf out of the oven the last of the day and broke it and handed him half the way she had the first day he rode out of the timber. My mother carried this starter west in a wagon, Caleb, and her mother carried it before that across an ocean. 3 generations of women who had every reason in the world to go bitter and hard, and every one of them kept this thing alive. Instead, this one soft living thing, and passed it down. I used to wonder why. Why keep feeding a crock of sour flour through every hard year, every death, every winter, like this one? She looked at the bread in her hands. I think I finally know. It's so that when the meanest thing the world can do to you is done, and you've got every right to answer it, mean right back, you've got something else in your hands instead. Something that only knows how to make, not take. Make. She met his eyes. They made me small, this valley, for years, and I found out this winter I'm not small at all. I'm the biggest thing on this whole mountain. And I don't mean my body, Caleb Walker, though. Lord knows there's plenty of that. Caleb Walker looked at her across the fire at this woman who had climbed a killing mountain and read a murdered beam and hung a banker with the United States mail and come down to feed the children of the cowards who'd cast her out. And whatever had been growing in him since he rode out of that timber and found her alive, stopped being something he could keep to himself. Margaret, he said. It was the first time he'd used her Christian name. I have known a great many strong people in my life. I never once knew a soul man, nor woman, with the size of you. He turned his half loaf in his big hands. And I find I don't want to ride back to the sweetgrass when the thaw comes. I find I'd as soon stay up here and haul your wood and break your trail and eat your bread for a good long while. If a widow that isn't small has got any use for a cattleman that owes her more than he can ever pay. The wind went over the top of the fold, the way it always did, and did not touch them. And Margaret Whitmore, who had not let herself want one single thing for herself in 2 long years, looked at the one man in all the world who had never once looked at her and seen something less than whole, and let herself want it. I might, she said. I just might, Caleb Walker. And the corner of her mouth turned up. But you'll have to learn to read wood first. I'm not marrying a man who can't tell an honest beam from a cut one. Caleb learned to read wood. He learned it those long weeks waiting for the thaw, kneeling beside her in the light of the oven with a splinter in his big hands, while she made him tell her honest break from cut over and over until he could do it blind. And if a man ever courted a woman, stranger than that, by lantern light over the grain of broken pine. Margaret never heard of it, and never once wished it different. But the reading of wood was the smallest of the things she taught him that winter, and not the most important. And it was the important one that near got them both killed. Because Margaret Whitmore had not survived a mountain and a banker by trusting that a thing was over just because it looked over. And late one night, with Prentice locked in Dobbs's little jail, and the whole valley eating her bread, and everyone but her breathing easier, she sat Caleb down and said the thing that had been eating at her. He's not finished, she said. Amos, he's sitting in that cell doing sums same as always, and there's only one line in the whole thing he can still change. She tapped her coat where the ledger rode against her heart. This. It's the only copy. Grayson can talk all he likes, but a jury weighs a wounded man's word against a banker's respectability, and it's a coin toss. The beam's strong, but a slick lawyer calls it weather and freak chance. The ledger, though the ledger is his own hand in his own book, and there's no talking around it. She looked at Caleb. So if I were Amos Prentice, sitting in that cell, I'd be thinking about one thing and one thing only. How to make that book disappear before a marshal ever lays eyes on it. He's behind bars, Caleb said. He can't touch it. No, but that hired man that bolted didn't bolt far. And a man like Prentice has got money nobody's found yet, and money buys a fire in the night, and a book gone to ash, and a story about how the poor mad widow made the whole thing up. She was already reaching for paper she'd traded 3 loaves for a ream of it from Hattie's store. Which is why you and I are going to spend the next 4 nights doing something, Caleb, and you're not going to like it because it's tedious as sin." They copied the ledger, every line, every figure. Margaret read, and Caleb wrote where his hand was steadier, and Margaret wrote where the figures were hers. To begin with, 4 nights bent over borrowed paper by oven light, until there were 2 books where there had been 1. The true ledger in Prentice's own hand, and a fair copy in theirs, witnessed and dated and signed by the sheriff himself. Then Margaret did the thing that saved it all. She took the real ledger, the original, the one thing in the world Amos Prentice needed destroyed, and she hid it. Not in her coat, not in the shelter. She rode Ruth halfway up the mountain in the dark, and she buried it wrapped in oilcloth in a tin box under a cairn of stones that looked like every other jumble of rock on that whole slope, and she told exactly one living soul where it was. And that soul was Caleb Walker, and she made him swear not to tell her if she ever asked him to, because a woman under threat might be made to ask. And the fair copy, the one in their hand, she left in plain sight in the drawer of Dobbs' desk, where anyone watching the jail would think the evidence was kept. "You think he'll go for it?" Caleb said. "I think," Margaret said, "that a man who'd starve children for land will do most anything. And I'd rather be wrong and careful than right and ruined." She was not wrong. It came on the 4th night after the darkest of the moon, and it came the way she'd said it would. The bolted hired man came back down out of the timber with a can of coal oil and a grudge, and he came for the sheriff's office where the town knew the widow's book was kept, and he'd have burned it, and Prentice's whole guilt with it, except that a big cattleman had been sleeping in the cold across the street every night for a week, with a rifle across his knees waiting, because a woman he was courting had told him to. Caleb had almost given it up that night. 6 nights in the cold with nothing, and a man starts to feel a fool. He'd said as much to Margaret at supper. And Margaret had only said, "One more night, Caleb. A patient man waits for the dark of the moon, because that's the night a fire doesn't get seen till it's caught. If nothing comes tonight, I'm wrong, and I'll say so, and haul you in by the fire where you belong." So he'd gone out one more night into the dark of the moon, and he'd waited. He heard the boots before he saw the man. Quiet boots, careful boots, coming up the far boardwalk toward the dark office. He heard the slosh of a can. He smelled the coal oil on the cold air. And he let the man get all the way to the door. Let him set the can down and reach for the latch before Caleb Walker rose up out of the shadow across the street and crossed it without a sound. "Evening," Caleb said, and the man froze with his hand on the latch and the muzzle of a rifle cold against the back of his neck. "You're about to do a real stupid thing for a man who's going to hang whether you do it or not. Set the can down. Slower than that. There. Now your hands where I can see 'em, and let's you and me go wake the sheriff." The man's nerve broke all at once the way Grayson's had. "He paid me," he babbled. "Prentice got word out somehow, promised me 200 to burn the book, said it was the only thing left, could I got debts, mister, I got." "Everybody in this valley's got debts," Caleb said. "It's how one man owned the lot of you. Walk." And when they searched him, they found folded in his coat a note in a soft, careful hand. No signature, a banker's caution to the last, promising a great deal of money for a fire and a burned book. And it was the final nail. The thing that turned Prentice's crime from a story about the past into an ongoing conspiracy. The man was running from his own cell, and even the slickest lawyer in the territory couldn't call that weather. "You want to tell me now?" Margaret said to the arsonist, standing over him in the jail, while Prentice watched gray-faced from the next cell. "That the book you came to burn was in that desk." Because it wasn't. It was never in that desk. What was in that desk was a copy, and the sheriff's got 3 more, and the real one's somewhere on a mountain you'll never find. And the only thing your fire would have done, mister, was prove to a federal marshal that Amos Prentice is exactly as guilty as I say he is. She turned to the banker. "You should have laughed at me, Amos. I keep telling you. You never could learn." Prentice did not answer. There was nothing left in his soft face to answer with. But he had one card he had not played, and he played it 2 days later when the arsonist had confessed, and the thaw was coming, and the banker could feel the federal net closing. He asked through the sheriff to speak with Margaret alone. She almost refused. Then she thought of Thomas, who'd always said you look a snake in the eye at least once, so you know its face, and she went. He was courteous even now. That was the horror of the man. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for coming." He spoke low through the bars, reasonable as a Sunday. "I'll be plain because you're a woman who values plainness. You've won. I concede it. So let me offer you a settlement the way any sensible party settles before a costly trial. Withdraw the matter of the mail. It's the only charge that brings a marshal, and without it, this stays a territorial affair I can manage. Do that, and I will sign back every deed I hold, every farm, every note. All of it tonight restored, and I leave the territory forever, and you never see my face again. The valley made whole in an hour without a trial, without a marshal, without the risk that some clever man like Ballard talks a jury round." The pale eyes were steady. "You want the land back. I'm offering you the land back. All of it. For one small mercy. What does it cost you to be merciful, Mrs. Whitmore?" It was, Margaret would think later, the cleverest thing he ever did because it was almost right. The land was what mattered. He was handing her the whole prize and asking only that she let him slip the one hook he couldn't wriggle off. "No," she said. Prentice blinked. "You'd risk the land itself, these families' homes, on a jury, out of what, spite?" "Out of the fact that a man who buys his way out of one crime is a man free to arrange the next one," Margaret said. "You'd give the land back and be 100 miles gone by spring, and in 5 years there'd be another valley and another roof and another woman nobody believed. No, Amos. I'm not trading a marshal for a deed. I'm going to get the land back and put you where you can't do it again, both because I can, because you were arrogant enough to write it all down and cruel enough to make a witness who lived." She stood. "You keep looking for the price of my mercy. There isn't one. That's the thing you never could understand about people you decided didn't count. We're not for sale. We never were. That's why you lost." She walked out and did not look back, and behind her Amos Prentice said her name once, and then nothing ever again. The marshal came with the thaw. He came up the opened pass on a government horse, a lean, weathered man named Beckett, with a federal star, and no debt to any soul in Silver Creek. And he brought a deputy, who could read a ledger, and between Margaret's testimony and the book in Prentice's own hand, and Grayson's confession, and the arsonist's note, and a beam with saw marks, that a federal man read in about the 2 seconds Margaret had promised the thing Amos Prentice had built over 11 patient years, came apart in a single week. But it was the land that mattered, and it was the land that gave Margaret her last hard fight and her sweetest. "The deeds are the trouble," Marshal Beckett told her, plain sitting across Hattie's counter with the ledgers spread between them. "You were right about the mail. That's federal, that's a hanging adjacent business, and it opens his books wide. But those farm deeds, ma'am, were signed. I've read 'em. Legally, they're clean. They were signed by starving men," Margaret said, "for grain that a man made scarce on purpose. You've got his own ledger showing he bought that flour to ruin it, and cut the roof to time it, and stole the mail to keep the one witness who could prove it. That's not commerce, Marshal. That's extortion with extra steps, and every one of those deeds is the fruit of it." Beckett looked at her a long time. "You'd have made a hell of a lawyer, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I'd have made a hell of a lot of things," Margaret said, "if anybody down here had ever once let me. Void the deeds, Marshal. Give these people back their land. That's the only justice that counts. Prentice in a cell doesn't put a plow back in a man's field." Beckett voided the deeds. It took a territorial judge and a stack of federal paper and the better part of the spring, but the fruit of extortion argument, held backed by a ledger no judge could wave off, and one by one the foreclosure notices came down off the doors of Silver Creek, and one by one the families came home. The Coopers came home first. Sam Cooper rode in from his cousin's place 2 valleys over on a borrowed horse, and he found Margaret at the rebuilt bakery, for they'd rebuilt it by then, the whole town raising the walls together. And this time when Margaret said, "Those beams need to be seasoned oak, not green pine, and set that ridge 2 hands higher," every man on the site did exactly as she said, without one word about a woman's place. And Sam Cooper got down off his horse and stood in front of her, twisting his hat the way he had the day he'd tried to stand up for her and been sat back down. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "I tried. That day. In the shop. I want you to know I tried, and I sat down, and I've hated myself for sitting down every day since. You were a boy with a family to protect and a banker's boot on your father's neck," Margaret said. "You stood up, Sam. That's more than any grown man in that room did. You stood up and I saw it, and I never once held the sitting down against you." She put a warm loaf in his hands. "Your land's yours again. Go home. Plant it. And the next time you see a thing that's wrong, you stand up and you stay standing, because you'll find it's a habit, the hardest one in the world to start and the best one to keep." The boy wept and took his bread and went home to his father's fields. They gave Caleb his money back. That was Beckett's doing the restitution every dollar Prentice had stolen out of the mail, 2 years of a cattleman's quiet debt to a dead man, recovered from the banker's private accounts, and pressed into Caleb Walker's hands by federal order. And Caleb held it, all that money, more than he'd sent, and more than he'd expected ever to see again. And he stood in the new bakery and looked at it, and then looked at Margaret, and he did a thing that made her love him past all sense. "This was never mine," he said. "I sent it for Thomas Whitmore's widow. It only ever went astray. So it's yours, Margaret. Every cent. 2 years of it come home at last to the person it was always meant for." "Caleb, it's yours," he said, and closed her hands around it. "Do what you want with it. You earned it up that mountain 10 times over." And Margaret Whitmore looked at more money than she had ever held in her life, enough to leave enough to go somewhere warm and easy, and never bake another loaf, or climb another mountain enough to be small and safe and comfortable for the rest of her days. And she knew exactly what she was going to do with it, and it was not any of that. She bought the notes. She went to Marshall Beckett and to the Territorial Bank that was sorting out the wreckage of Prentice's holdings, and she used every dollar of Caleb's recovered money, and she bought up the outstanding notes on Silver Creek, the store, the parsonage, the little house where a sheriff and his granddaughter lived, the jail, the church with its new bell, all the paper Amos Prentice had used to make a whole town afraid. She bought it all. And then she forgave it. "You can't," Hattie said when she understood. "Margaret, that's everything. That's your one chance to ever be comfortable. You can't just—" "I can do exactly as I please with my own money," Margaret said, "for the first time in my life, and it pleases me to do this." She stood in the middle of the town that had thrown her in the snow, and she raised her voice the way she had the day she came down with the bread. "Silver Creek, there's no more paper. You hear me? No more notes coming due. No more man in a warm coat at your door asking for a signature. No more being afraid of what you owe. It's paid. All of it. Forgiven. You don't owe the bank, and you don't owe Prentice, and you don't owe me not a dollar, not a favor, not a thing." Her voice rang. "I spent years in this town being made small by what I owed and what I couldn't do and what I wasn't. I will not hold one soul here in that same cold place. You're free. Go be better than you were. That's the only interest I'll ever charge." There was no weeping this time. It had gone past weeping. There was only a silence, and then a sound Margaret had never once heard in all her years in Silver Creek. Not for her, the sound of a whole town all at once saying her name like it meant something. Amos Prentice was convicted in the Territorial Court that summer on the federal charge that Margaret had found in the dark of the ruined bakery theft from the United States Mail, and on the deeper charges her ledger opened up beneath it. Walter Grayson turned state's evidence and got his years and worse for a man like him his name. He would be for the rest of his life the baker who cut his own roof and starved his own town, and there is no cell built that holds a man tighter than that. The hired arsonist testified in exchange for his neck, and Margaret Whitmore sat in that courtroom in a dress Hattie had sewn her. And when they called her to testify, she stood up to her full size and did not shrink 1 inch. Prentice had bought himself the slickest lawyer in the territory, a smooth city man named Ballard, who rose to cross-examine her with a pitying little smile, and he tried the only door left open to him. He tried the door the whole valley had once walked through. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ballard said gently, "you'll forgive me, but this court has heard testimony that after you were let go from your position, a difficult thing, A blow to any woman you walked alone into a blizzard in December and lived for 2 months in the mountains by yourself. Is that so? It is. Talking by your own account to a mule, and to a jar of yeast, and to your late husband who is deceased. The pitying smile widened. Mrs. Whitmore, there is a name that has followed you down out of those mountains. I won't be cruel enough to say it, but I must ask the jury to consider whether a woman in such a state, grieving alone, cast out holding conversations with the dead, is a reliable reader of ledgers and beams, or whether she is a poor soul who has built a comforting story out of her own. Mr. Ballard? Margaret's voice cut across his like a blade across bread. You're about to say mad. Go on and say it. It's the word your clients paid you to say, and you've been circling it for a minute now, and I'd as soon you said it to my face the way he never quite dared. The courtroom went dead still. Here is the trouble with your story, sir, Margaret said, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned on a mountain that you never had to. A mad woman doesn't build a stone oven that holds heat through a killing winter. You can go up and put your soft city hands on it. It's still standing. A mad woman doesn't grow greens in the snow, or read a saw cut in a fallen beam, or carry 2 years of a banker's own figures in her head. And a mad woman. Mr. Ballard most surely does not sit here and read you line by line out of Amos Prentice's private ledger, in his own hand, the exact dollar he stole out of the United States mail on the 14th of April, 2 years gone, which I can do right now if the court would like, and which no lunatic on God's earth could. She turned to the jury. They called me mad because it was cheaper than calling me right. That's all that word ever was. It's what men reach for when a woman knows a thing they'd rather she didn't. And I'd ask you gentlemen to notice that in all his questions, this lawyer has not once, not one single time said the figures in that book are wrong. Because they aren't. And he knows they aren't. And that's the whole case right there. Ballard opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his papers. No further questions, he said. There was not a soul in that court who could look at Margaret Whitmore after that and see anything small. Prentice spoke to her only once afterward as they took him out. You should have taken the warm room, he said. It was all he had left. It was the same thing he'd said in the snow, the same thing he'd said in the wreckage. A man with only one card and no idea he'd already lost with it every time he'd played it. Margaret looked at him. No Amos, she said. And there was no heat in it, and no triumph. Only the plain, flat truth of a woman who had finally stopped being afraid of anyone. You should have moved the flower, that's all. Any day in October, you could have listened to a fat widow about a roof, and none of this would ever have happened, and you'd be a rich man tonight instead of a caught one. You didn't lose to me. You lost to the fact that I was right, and you couldn't stand to hear it from someone you'd decided didn't count. She turned away from him for the last time. Goodbye, Mr. Prentice. God keep you. I mean that. Somebody ought to. And that was the last she ever spoke to him, and the last she ever thought of him, because a person who has finally been made whole has better things to fill her mind than the man who tried to make her small. They married in June in the fold in the mountain, beside the warm spring that never froze with the oven, throwing its heat, and the whole valley climbed up the opened trail to stand witness, the same trail they'd once climbed hat in hand for bread. Reverend Pauling asked to perform it humbly, and Margaret let him, because she had come over the spring to a kind of peace with the man. Not forgiveness exactly, but the next thing over from it, the thing where you let a person spend the rest of their life proving they've changed. He married them under the open sky, and his voice did not shake this time. And when he said, "Is there any soul here who objects?" the whole valley laughed, because the notion was absurd, because there was not a person in Montana Territory by then who did not know exactly who Margaret Whitmore was and exactly what she was worth. Ellie Dobbs stood up front the whole time in a dress with a ribbon grinning fit to split, and when it was done, when Caleb Walker had kissed his wife, and the valley had cheered, and the bread was going round, Margaret knelt down in front of the child, the way she had knelt in the snow at the edge of town on the worst day of her life, and she took the tin star off from around her own neck, the lucky star that had crossed a killing mountain against her heart, and come back down again, and she made to give it back. No, Ellie said, and closed Margaret's fingers over its small hands over scarred ones. It's yours. You kept it all winter. It brought you home. It's yours now. It brought me home, Margaret agreed softly. You brought me home, Ellie. You were the only one who never once stopped watching the sky. She looped the star back over her own head, where it had ridden all winter, where it would ride the rest of her life. I'll keep it then. And someday when you're grown, and it's your turn to be the one who won't give up on somebody, the whole world's given up on you. Come find me, and I'll tell you how a 9-year-old with frozen braids saved a woman's life just by refusing to believe she was gone. Because that's the truest story I know, and you're the hero of it, and don't you let anybody ever tell you different. By that summer, the fold in the mountain had a name, and the name was on lips clear to the railhead and beyond. They called it the Widow's Valley, and then just Whitmore's, and they came from all over the territory to see it, to see the oven that baked through a killing winter, the garden that grew green in the snow, the spring that never froze, and the woman who'd built it all with her own 2 hands when a whole town swore she'd die, and Margaret taught them. That was the breakthrough, the thing that turned one woman's survival into something that outlived her. She taught. She taught them to build the ovens, thick-walled and low, that would carry a family through any winter the mountains threw. She taught them to read timber, honest break from cut, so no man's roof would ever come down on him unwarned again. She taught them to store food against the hard months, to bank a fire to keep a starter alive through the lean years, the way 3 generations of hard women had kept hers. Farmers came and learned better methods and went home and taught their neighbors. Women came who'd been told all their lives they were too big or too plain or too poor or too much, and they climbed down that mountain standing straighter than they'd climbed up it, because they had watched what one such woman had made of a place that was supposed to be her grave. And every one of them before they left got a loaf of bread and the same words. The world will try to make you small, Margaret told them every one. It'll use your body or your money or your grief or your kindness, whatever handle it can get. And the day it does, the day they throw you in the snow, you look at your own 2 hands, and you remember every single thing they can do that the hands that threw you can't. And then you go build something, not out of spite. Out of spite, you build nothing that lasts. You build because building is the one answer they can never take back. Caleb Walker never did return to the Sweetgrass Flats. He sold his cattle and moved his life up into the fold in the mountain, and he hauled the wood and broke the trail and read the wood honest, and he spent the rest of his days beside the one person who'd never once needed him to make her whole, and chose him anyway. Which is, if a body thinks on it, the only kind of love worth the name. He was heard to say more than once to more than one traveler who came up the trail, wondering at the place that he'd gone up a mountain after 11 head of cattle, and come down with the whole meaning of his life, and that Thomas Whitmore, holding a beam in the dark, so a green boy could crawl out under his arm, had saved that boy twice, once from the mine, and once years later, and without ever knowing it, by leaving behind the finest woman in the Montana Territory for that same boy to grow into a man worthy of. Margaret lived a long time, long enough to see the little bakery in Silver Creek pass to Ellie Dobbs Grown, who baked the cinnamon twists and never once burned the bottoms. Long enough to see the valley she'd been left to die in become the valley folks came to be saved by. Long enough that the story of the widow they abandoned to the blizzard stopped being a thing Silver Creek was ashamed of and started being the thing it was proudest of. The tale every grandmother told every child, the one that always ended the same way, with the same hard-won truth, that a whole town learned the winter it very nearly lost its soul. You can throw a woman in the snow. You can call her small and mad and dead and gone. You can shut every door and ring every bell, and leave her to the mountain and tell yourselves the mountain will do your cruelty for you. But you had better pray you were wrong about her. Because Margaret Whitmore walked into that blizzard with nothing but an old mule, a dead man's map, and a crock of sourdough held against her heart, and she walked back out of it, holding the whole valley's life in her flower-scarred hands. They left a widow to freeze, and months later, That same widow was baking the bread that fed every child who'd watched her go. The person the world decides is worth nothing is so often the one thing standing between that world and the dark. And the day you learn to see it, before you throw her away instead of after, is the day you finally deserve to be saved. Silver Creek learned it late, but it learned it, and it never ever forgot.